The morning mist clung to the Colorado peaks like ghostly fingers, refusing to release their grip on the rugged landscape below. Sarah Beth Williams pressed her gloved hand against the cold window of the stagecoach, watching the endless expanse of pine trees and granite cliffs roll past in a blur of green and gray. Her reflection stared back from the glass, half her face beautiful, unmarked, while the other half bore the twisted, discolored skin that had become her constant companion 3 years ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The letter in her worn reticule crinkled as the coach hit another rut in the mountain road. She had read those careful, hopeful words so many times that she could recite them from memory. Dear Miss Williams, I am in need of a wife who understands hardship and values a simple life in God's country. I have a cabin, good land, and an honest heart to offer. If you are willing to build a life among the mountains of Colorado Territory, I believe we could find happiness together. Yours truly, James Morrison. Simple words, but they had been a lifeline when everything else in her world had crumbled to ash literally. The textile mill fire in Massachusetts had taken more than her beauty. It had stolen her future, her fiancé, her place in the only world she had ever known. The elegant drawing rooms of Boston society had no place for a woman whose face bore the permanent reminder of industrial tragedy. As the stagecoach rounded another bend, Sarah Beth caught sight of Timber Falls for the first time. The settlement was barely more than a cluster of weathered buildings huddled against the mountainside, as if seeking shelter from the vast wilderness that surrounded it. A general store, a blacksmith, a small church with a modest bell tower, and perhaps a dozen houses scattered along what generously could be called a main street. Smoke rose from chimneys and thin gray ribbons, dissipating quickly in the thin mountain air. The coach lurched to a stop outside the general store, and the driver's gruff voice called down, "Timber Falls. End of the line, miss." Sarah Beth gathered her few belongings, a small trunk that contained everything she owned, her mother's Bible, and the carefully preserved daguerreotype of her family taken before the fire changed everything. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her bonnet, making sure the wide brim cast enough shadow to partially conceal the scarred side of her face. The driver helped her down from the coach, his eyes quickly darting away when he glimpsed her scars in the afternoon light. She had grown accustomed to that reaction, the initial shock, followed by uncomfortable avoidance. It was better than the looks of pity or disgust she sometimes encountered. "You expecting someone to meet you, miss?" the driver asked, already beginning to unload her trunk. "Yes," she replied softly, though doubt crept into her voice as she scanned the few people visible on the street. None of them seemed to be looking for anyone in particular. "Mr. James Morrison." The driver nodded and tipped his hat. "Well, I'm sure he'll be along directly. Good luck to you, miss." As the stagecoach disappeared around the bend, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake, Sarah Beth found herself truly alone for the first time since beginning this journey. The silence of the mountains was profound, broken only by the distant sound of wind through the pines and the occasional creak of wooden buildings settling in the afternoon heat. She positioned herself near her trunk and waited, trying to ignore the curious glances from the few townspeople who passed by. An elderly woman emerged from the general store, pausing to study Sarah Beth with frank interest before hurrying on her way. Two men loading supplies onto a wagon spoke in low voices, their eyes occasionally drifting in her direction. The sun began its descent toward the western peaks, casting long shadows across the street. Sarah Beth's stomach clenched with a familiar mixture of anxiety and hunger. She had eaten sparingly during the journey, mindful of her dwindling funds. The little money she had managed to save from her work at the millinery shop after the fire was nearly gone, spent on the long journey west. An hour passed, then two. The afternoon shadows grew longer, and the mountain air carried an increasing chill. Sarah Beth pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, fighting back the rising panic that threatened to overwhelm her. What if James Morrison had changed? His mind? What if he had seen her arrive and decided that even a mail-order bride wasn't worth taking on a woman with her? Condition? She thought of the last letter she had sent, the one where she had tried to be honest about her appearance. I must tell you that I bear scars from an industrial accident. If this changes your feelings about our arrangement, I will. Understand completely. His response had been brief but reassuring. We all bear scars of one kind or another. What matters is the heart beneath. But words on paper were different from reality. She had learned that bitter lesson when her fiancé, Thomas, had taken one look at her bandaged face in the hospital and mumbled excuses about needing time to think. She never saw him again, though she heard through mutual acquaintances that he had married a merchant's daughter within 6 months. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah Beth made a decision. She couldn't stand on this street corner indefinitely. With considerable effort, she managed to drag her trunk toward the general store. The proprietor, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and graying hair, looked up from his ledger as she entered. Good evening, miss. You look like you could use some assistance. I'm looking for James Morrison, she said, keeping her scarred side turned away from the lamplight. I was supposed to meet him here today. The man's expression grew puzzled. James Morrison? I'm afraid I don't know anyone by that name in these parts. Been here 15 years, and I know most folks for 50 miles around. Sarah Beth's heart sank like a stone in deep water. Are you certain? He said he had a cabin and land near Timber Falls. Positive, miss. Could be you've got the wrong town. There's a Timber Creek about a day's ride north, and Cedar Falls is 2 days south. She shook her head slowly. The letter had clearly stated Timber Falls, Colorado Territory. No, this is the place he mentioned. The shopkeeper's wife appeared from the back room, wiping her hands on her apron. What's the trouble, Henry? Young lady here is looking for someone named James Morrison. Says she was supposed to meet him. The woman's face softened with sympathy. Oh dear, I'm afraid there's been some mistake. You look worn to the bone, child. Why don't you come back to the kitchen and have some coffee while we sort this out? Sarah Beth wanted to refuse pride, demanded that she handle this crisis with dignity, but exhaustion and hunger made the decision for her. She followed the woman, Mrs. Patterson, to a cozy kitchen behind the store. The warmth from the cook stove was a blessing after hours in the cold mountain air. Now then, Mrs. Patterson said, bustling about to pour coffee and slice bread. Tell me about this Mr. Morrison. How did you come to meet him? Sarah Beth's fingers trembled as she reached for the coffee cup. The warmth seeped through the ceramic, providing comfort for both her hands and her frayed nerves. We corresponded for several months. He advertised for a wife in a Boston newspaper. I needed a fresh start. She didn't elaborate on why she needed that fresh start, but Mrs. Patterson's sharp eyes had already noticed the careful way Sarah Beth positioned herself to keep the scarred side of her face in shadow. Did you keep his letters? Mrs. Patterson asked gently. Sarah Beth nodded and retrieved the small bundle from her reticule. Mrs. Patterson examined them carefully, her frown deepening with each page. Henry, she called to her husband, who appeared in the doorway. Come look at this. Something's not right about these letters. Mr. Patterson took the correspondence and studied it closely. After several minutes, he shook his head grimly. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, miss, but I believe you've been the victim of a cruel deception. What do you mean? Sarah Beth's voice was barely a whisper. The paper's good quality and the handwriting's educated, but look here at the postal markings. These were all sent from Denver, not from any mountain town. And see how the ink varies? Like they were written at different times but all sent together. The implications hit Sarah Beth like a physical blow. Someone had deliberately misled her. stringing her along with false promises while she spent her meager savings on the journey west. But why? What could anyone gain from such cruelty? "There are men," Mrs. Patterson said quietly, her voice filled with disgust, "who take pleasure in deceiving vulnerable women. Sometimes for money, sometimes just for the sport of it." Sarah Beth set down the coffee cup with shaking hands. The full magnitude of her situation was becoming clear. She was stranded in a remote mountain town with no money, no prospects, and no way to return to the life she had left behind. Not that there was much of a life to return to. "What am I going to do?" The words escaped as a broken whisper. Mrs. Patterson reached across the table and covered Sarah Beth's ungloved hand with her own weathered one. "First, you're going to spend the night here. We have a small room above the store. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." "I can't pay you," Sarah Beth said, shame burning in her cheeks. "I spent nearly everything on the journey. Did I ask for payment?" Mrs. Patterson's voice was firm but kind. "There's not a soul in this town who hasn't faced hard times. We look after our own here." That night, in the small room above the general store, Sarah Beth lay awake listening to the sounds of the mountain night. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a lonely, mournful sound that seemed to echo the desolation in her own heart. She touched the scarred side of her face, feeling the familiar ridges and valleys of damaged skin. In Boston, she had been someone, daughter of a respected clerk, engaged to a promising young businessman, welcomed in society despite her family's modest means. The fire had changed everything in a matter of minutes. The mill's emergency exits had been locked, trapping dozens of workers inside when the blaze erupted. She had been one of the fortunate ones, if survival with permanent disfigurement could be called fortunate. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The months that followed had been a slow education in how quickly the world could turn its back on someone who no longer fit its definition of acceptable. Thomas's abandonment had been just the beginning. Friends became distant, job prospects evaporated, and even her own family struggled to know how to treat her. Her mother still loved her, of course, but Sarah Beth had seen the grief in her eyes, grief for the daughter she had been, the future that was lost. The advertisement for mail-order brides had seemed like providence, a chance to start over somewhere far from pitying looks and whispered conversations. A man who claimed to value character over appearance, who promised a simple life built on honest work and mutual respect. Now, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling beams in the darkness, Sarah Beth wondered if she was naive to believe such a thing was possible. Perhaps her scars marked her as permanently damaged, destined for a life of solitude and charity. The next morning brought no solutions, only the harsh clarity of daylight. Mrs. Patterson provided breakfast and gentle conversation. But the fundamental problem remained unchanged. Sarah Beth was stranded with no resources and no clear path forward. "There might be work for you here," Mrs. Patterson suggested over coffee. Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house mentioned needing help with cleaning and cooking. It wouldn't pay much, but it would give you a roof and meals. Sarah Beth considered this. A life as a cleaning woman in a remote mountain town was far from what she had imagined, but it was honest work. Perhaps in time she could save enough money to what? Return to Boston? Start over somewhere else? "I would be grateful for any work," she said finally. It was then that they heard the commotion outside, voices raised in what sounded like an argument, followed by the heavy tread of boots on the wooden walkway. Mrs. Patterson frowned and moved to the window. "That's strange," she murmured. "Someone's coming up from the high country, and they look like they've been traveling hard." Sarah Beth joined her at the window, careful to stay back from the glass. A man was tying his horse to the hitching post in front of the store. Even from a distance, she could see that he was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that spoke of long days in the wilderness. There was something about the way he moved, purposeful, confident, but with an underlying gentleness in how he handled his obviously tired horse, that caught her attention. "That's Thomas Blackwood," Mrs. Patterson said, her tone carrying a note of surprise. "He rarely comes down from his cabin unless it's absolutely necessary. Wonder what brings him to town." As if sensing their observation, the man looked up toward the window. For just a moment, his eyes seemed to meet Sarah Beth's across the distance, and she stepped quickly back into the shadows, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't explain. Below, Thomas Blackwood gathered his saddlebags and headed toward the store entrance, his weathered face set in lines of grim determination. Whatever had brought him down from the mountains, it was clear that his business in Timber Falls was urgent. The heavy footsteps on the wooden stairs made Sarah Beth's pulse quicken. She heard Mr. Patterson's greeting below, followed by a deep voice that seemed to carry the weight of the mountains themselves. The conversation was muted, but she caught fragments, something about supplies and urgent business. Mrs. Patterson noticed her tension. "Thomas is a good man, dear. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's never been anything but decent to folks in town. Lost his family some years back in an avalanche. Been living alone up on Copper Ridge ever since." The words stirred something unexpected in Sarah Beth's chest, a recognition of shared loss, perhaps. She found herself listening more intently to the conversation below, trying to discern the character of this mountain man from the cadence of his speech. "I need to speak with whoever's handling arrangements for the Henderson place." Thomas's voice carried clearly now. "Heard in town that Mrs. Henderson's looking for help." "Funny you should mention that," Mr. Patterson replied. "We've got a young lady here who's in need of work." Sarah Beth's stomach clenched. The last thing she wanted was charity or pity from a stranger, especially one who might take one look at her and change his mind about whatever arrangement he had in mind. "I'll fetch her," Mrs. Patterson whispered, but Sarah Beth caught her arm. "Please," she said quietly. Let me prepare myself first." Mrs. Patterson's eyes softened with understanding. She had already noticed how carefully Sarah Beth positioned herself, always keeping the scarred side of her face turned away from direct light. "Of course, dear. Take your time." Sarah Beth moved to the small mirror above the wash basin, studying her reflection with the critical eye she had developed over the past 3 years. The left side of her face remained untouched by the fire-smooth skin, a clear blue eye, lips that had once been called lovely. But the right side told a different story entirely. The scars began at her temple, spreading down across her cheek and jaw in a twisted pattern of raised, discolored tissue. The fire had been merciless, melting fabric to skin, creating ridges and valleys that no amount of healing could completely smooth. Her right eye had been spared, though the skin around it was permanently pulled tight, giving her an asymmetrical appearance that she had never grown accustomed to seeing. She remembered the first time she had looked in a mirror after the bandages came off. Her mother had been beside her, tears streaming down her face as she tried to find comforting words. "It's not so bad, Sarah Beth. In time, perhaps, there might be treatments. But they both knew the truth. In 1871, there were no treatments for burns this severe. What remained was what she would carry for the rest of her life. The mirror in the Patterson spare room showed her the same reality she faced every morning. She adjusted her hair carefully, arranging the waves to fall forward on the damaged side, then positioned her bonnet to create as much shadow as possible. It was a routine born of necessity and practiced to perfection. The conversation below had moved outside, giving her time to compose herself. Through the window, she could see Thomas Blackwood more clearly now. He was indeed a large man, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of solid build that came from years of physical labor. His clothes were practical, sturdy pants, a wool shirt, and a jacket that had seen considerable wear. There was something about his bearing that suggested competence and reliability, qualities that had become precious to Sarah Beth after her recent deception. As she watched, he knelt beside his horse, checking the animal's legs with gentle, practiced hands. The gesture spoke of a man who cared for his animals, who understood responsibility and stewardship. It was a small thing, but after months of correspondence with a man who turned out to be entirely fictional, Sarah Beth found herself noting every detail that might indicate character. She made her way downstairs carefully, each step measured and deliberate. The conversation outside had paused, and she could hear Thomas talking quietly to his horse, words of reassurance and praise. That made her smile despite her nervousness. Mrs. Patterson met her at the bottom of the stairs. "He seems like a decent sort," she whispered. "And he's specifically looking for someone to help with household management up at the old Henderson cabin. Apparently, he's been hired to restore the place." "Household management?" Sarah Beth's eyebrows rose. "I thought Mrs. Henderson needed help at the boarding house." "Different Henderson, dear. This is about the old mining claim up on Copper Ridge. The family abandoned it last winter, but apparently someone's bought the property and wants to make it livable again." The implications were both encouraging and terrifying. Work in an isolated mountain cabin meant steady employment, but it also meant being alone with a stranger in the wilderness. Everything her Boston upbringing had taught her warned against such an arrangement, yet what choice did she have? They stepped outside together, and Sarah Beth got her first clear look at Thomas Blackwood. He was even more imposing up close, easily 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and hands that showed the calluses of hard work. His hair was dark brown with threads of premature gray at the temples, and his eyes were the deep green of mountain pines, but it was his face that surprised her most. Despite the weathered skin and the lines etched by sun and wind, there was a gentleness there, a kind of quiet sorrow that spoke of deep understanding. "Mr. Blackwood," Mrs. Patterson said, "I'd like you to meet Miss Sarah Beth Williams. She's recently arrived from Massachusetts and is looking for employment." Thomas removed his hat, revealing more of that unruly dark hair. His eyes met Sarah Beth's directly, and she saw them take in her appearance, the careful arrangement of her hair, the shadows cast by her bonnet, and yes, the visible portion of her scars. But unlike every other first meeting she'd experienced in the past 3 years, his expression didn't change. No shock, no awkward avoidance, no barely concealed pity. "Miss Williams," he said simply, his voice carrying a warmth that surprised her. "Mrs. Patterson tells me you're in need of work." "Yes, sir," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "I have experience with household management, cooking, and general domestic duties." He nodded thoughtfully. "The position I'm offering isn't in town. The Henderson place is about 8 miles up the mountain, accessible only by horseback or on foot. It's been empty for months, so there's considerable work involved in making it habitable again. The isolation can be challenging." Sarah Beth sensed there was more behind those words, some deeper understanding of what isolation could mean. "I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Blackwood, and solitude doesn't frighten me." Something shifted in his expression at that, a flicker of recognition that suggested he understood exactly what she meant. "The pay would be fair room board and $20 a month. There's a separate cabin on the property that would be yours, so you'd have privacy. I'd be working on the main house and the outbuildings, but our paths would cross regularly." $20 a month was more than she had dared hope for, especially with room and board included. But there were practical considerations that couldn't be ignored. "Mr. Blackwood," she said carefully, "I feel I should be honest about my circumstances. I was deceived by a man claiming to offer marriage, and I find myself stranded here with very limited resources. If you're looking for someone with impeccable references or a spotless reputation, I may not be suitable." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with those thoughtful green eyes. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "Miss Williams, I'm not interested in your past circumstances or anyone else's opinion of your reputation. What matters to me is whether you're willing to work hard and whether you can handle being in the mountains during winter. Everything else is your own business." The simple acceptance in his words nearly undid her composure. It had been so long since someone had spoken to her without judgment or pity that she had almost forgotten what it felt like. "I would be very grateful for the opportunity," she said quietly. "There is one more thing," Thomas continued, his expression growing more serious. "The work up there can be dangerous. Mountain weather changes fast, and there are wild animals, bears, wolves, mountain cats. You'd need to follow safety protocols without question. Your life could depend on it." Sarah Beth thought of the mill fire, of the terror of being trapped with flames on all sides, of the sound of screaming and the smell of burning flesh. Physical danger seemed almost trivial compared to the emotional devastation she had already survived. "I understand," she said simply. Thomas studied her for another moment, then nodded. "We'll leave tomorrow morning, if that suits you. I need to finish gathering supplies today." "That would be perfect." As Thomas headed into the general store to complete his business, Mrs. Patterson squeezed Sarah Beth's arm. "I think you've made a good choice, dear. Thomas Blackwood is known for his integrity. If he says he'll treat you fairly, he will." That evening, as Sarah Beth packed her few belongings, she found herself thinking about the strange turn her life had taken. 3 days ago, she had been en route to meet a husband who turned out to be a fiction. Now she was preparing to travel into the wilderness with a man she had known for less than an hour, to take on work she had never imagined doing. But there had been something in Thomas Blackwood's manner that inspired confidence. He had looked at her scars without flinching, spoken to her without condescension, and offered her honest work without demands for explanations she wasn't ready to give. It was more respect than she had received from anyone in months. As she folded her mother's quilt, one of the few personal items she had brought west, Sarah Beth allowed herself a moment of grief for the life she had left behind. Boston had been her world for 23 years. She had known every street, every shop, every social convention. The mill fire had destroyed more than just buildings and lives. It had shattered the illusion of safety and predictability that had defined her existence. The scarring was only the visible part of what the fire had taken from her. The invisible wounds ran deeper, the loss of confidence, the shattering of her faith in the future, the slow erosion of her sense of self-worth as one door after another closed in her face. Thomas's rejection had been the final blow, convincing her that she would never again be worthy of love or even basic human companionship. The mail-order bride advertisement had seemed like a chance to reinvent herself somewhere far from the pitying looks and whispered conversations. Even if love wasn't possible, perhaps she could find acceptance, a partnership built on mutual need rather than romantic feeling. The correspondence with James Morrison had fed that hope, creating an elaborate fantasy of a simple life in the mountains with a man who claimed to value character over beauty. Now, sitting in a spare room above a general store in a town she had never heard of a week ago, Sarah Beth wondered if she was making another mistake. Was she being naive to trust Thomas Blackwood? Was she exchanging one form of vulnerability for another? But as she considered her alternatives, returning to Boston with her tail between her legs, staying in Timber Falls as an object of charity, or venturing into the unknown with a stranger who had offered her honest work and fair treatment, the choice seemed clear. At least in the mountains, her failures would be her own, and her successes, however small, would belong to her as well. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of brilliant blue sky that seemed possible only in the high country. Thomas arrived at the general store just after sunrise, leading a sturdy mare along with his own mount. "She's gentle but sure-footed," he said, indicating the mare. "Her name's Buttercup. Mrs. Henderson's daughter learned to ride on her." Sarah Beth approached the horse carefully. She had ridden as a child. Her father had believed it was an important skill for a young lady, but it had been years since she had been in a saddle. "Hello, Buttercup," she murmured, offering her hand for the mare to sniff. The horse's warm breath on her palm was oddly comforting. "She likes you," Thomas observed. "That's a good sign." As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Patterson pressed a package of food into Sarah Beth's hands. "For the journey," she said firmly, brushing away Sarah Beth's protests. "And you write to me, do you hear? Let me know how you're getting on." The kindness of this stranger, who owed her nothing, brought tears to Sarah Beth's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." "We take care of our own," Mrs. Patterson repeated, echoing her words from the previous day. "And you're one of ours now, whether you know it or not." As they rode out of Timber Falls, Sarah Beth looked back only once. The little mountain town was already beginning to feel like home in a way that Boston never had again after the fire. There was something about the honesty of the place, the straightforward way people dealt with each other, that appealed to her wounded spirit. The trail Thomas led her on was narrow and steep, winding through stands of pine and aspen that filled the morning air with their fresh, clean scent. The higher they climbed, the more the weight of her past seemed to lift from her shoulders. Each mile took her further from the woman she had been and closer to whoever she might become in this new place. "Tell me about the Henderson place," she said during a rest stop, more to break the comfortable silence than from any pressing need to know. Doc Thomas handed her a canteen of cold mountain water. Old Henrik Henderson staked that claim back in '65, convinced there was silver in the mountain. Spent 5 years digging tunnels and hauling ore, but never found enough to make it pay. His wife, Martha, tried to make a go of it after he died. But last winter was too hard. She took the children and moved down to Denver. "Is there really silver up there?" "Maybe." Henrik wasn't much of a miner, but he was persistent. "The new owner thinks it's worth investigating with modern techniques." Thomas's expression grew thoughtful. "Sometimes the treasure isn't what you expect to find, though." As they continued their ascent, Sarah Beth found herself studying her companion. He moved through the wilderness with the confidence of someone completely at home in the natural world, reading signs in the landscape that were invisible to her. His horse responded to the slightest touch, suggesting a partnership built on mutual trust and understanding. "Have you always lived in the mountains?" she asked. "Not always." His voice carried a note of finality that suggested the subject was closed, but after a moment, he continued. "I came out here after the war. Seemed like a good place to start." Over. The simple statement revealed more than perhaps he intended. Sarah Beth recognized the tone, the voice of someone who had left more behind than they cared to discuss. It occurred to her that she wasn't the only one seeking refuge in the high country, and the thought was oddly comforting. The sun was approaching its zenith when they crested a ridge, and Thomas called a halt. "There it is," he said simply. Sarah Beth followed his gaze and felt her breath catch. The Henderson place sprawled across a natural meadow surrounded by towering peaks. The main house was larger than she had expected, a 2-story log structure with a wide porch and stone chimney. Several outbuildings dotted the property, including what looked like a barn, a smokehouse, and a smaller cabin that would presumably be her home. But it was the setting that truly took her breath away. The meadow was carpeted with wildflowers, Indian, paintbrush, mountain lupine, and varieties she couldn't name, all blazing with color against the emerald grass. A stream meandered through the property, its water so clear she could see the stones on the bottom even from this distance. Beyond it all, the mountains rose in every direction, their snow-capped peaks gleaming like jewels in the afternoon sun. "It's beautiful," she whispered, and meant it completely. Thomas smiled for the first time since she had met him, and the expression transformed his entire face. "I thought you might appreciate it. Not everyone sees the beauty in wild places." As they descended toward the homestead, Sarah Beth felt something shift inside her, a stirring of possibility she hadn't experienced since before the fire. Whatever lay ahead, whatever challenges awaited in this remote mountain valley, she would face them as herself, without pretense or apology. For the first time in 3 years, that felt like enough. The first week at the Henderson place unfolded in a rhythm of purposeful work and careful avoidance. Sarah Beth threw herself into the task of making the smaller cabin habitable, grateful for the physical demands that left little energy for brooding. The previous occupants had left the structure sound, but neglected dust coating every surface. Mice having claimed the pantry, and windows so grimy they barely let in light. Thomas worked on the main house with the same methodical precision he had shown on the trail. She could hear him throughout the day, the steady rhythm of his hammer, the scrape of his plane smoothing rough wood, the occasional rumble of his voice as he talked to his horse while taking breaks. But their interactions remained strictly professional, limited to brief exchanges about supplies and work schedules. It was exactly what Sarah Beth had expected, and yet somehow disappointing in ways she couldn't articulate. The cabin had 2 rooms, a main living area with a stone fireplace, and a smaller space that served as a bedroom. The furniture was simple but well made: a table and 2 chairs, a narrow bed with a straw mattress, and a cupboard for her few belongings. After days of scrubbing and organizing, she had transformed the space into something approaching cozy. The morning of her 8th day in the mountains, Sarah Beth was kneeling in the small garden plot behind her cabin, trying to salvage what remained of Martha Henderson's vegetable plants. The late-season tomatoes showed promise, and the herb garden had gone wild but was still recognizable. She was coaxing a particularly stubborn weed from among the sage plants when she heard an unfamiliar sound, a low rumbling that seemed to come from the forest beyond the meadow. She straightened, wiping her hands on the apron Mrs. Patterson had insisted she take. The sound came again, closer this time, and definitely not human. Sarah Beth's pulse quickened as she remembered Thomas's warnings about mountain wildlife. The rumbling resolved into something that made her blood run cold: the unmistakable sound of a bear huffing and snorting, accompanied by the crash of something large moving through the underbrush. She looked toward the main house, but Thomas was nowhere to be seen. His horse was in the makeshift corral, so he couldn't have gone far. But the barn blocked her view of where he might be working. The bear emerged from the tree line about 50 yards away, a massive brown shape that seemed impossibly large in the bright morning sunlight. Sarah Beth had never seen a bear outside of a zoo, and she was utterly unprepared for the raw power the animal radiated. It moved with surprising grace for something so enormous, its attention fixed on something near the stream. Terror rooted her to the spot. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but some fragment of knowledge suggested that running was exactly the wrong thing to do. The bear hadn't noticed her yet. It was investigating what looked like the remains of fish someone had cleaned near the water's edge. Very slowly, Sarah Beth began backing toward her cabin, trying to remember everything she had ever heard about bear encounters. Don't run. Don't make sudden movements. Try to appear large. Make noise. Or did it not make noise? Her mind was a blank slate of panic. The bear looked up from its investigation, massive head swiveling in her direction. For a moment that stretched into eternity, predator and prey regarded each other across the meadow. The animal's dark eyes held an intelligence that was somehow more terrifying than mindless aggression would have been. Then, without warning, the bear began moving toward her. Sarah Beth's breath came in short, sharp gasps as the animal approached with what seemed like casual curiosity. She was still perhaps 20 feet from her cabin door, but it might as well have been 20 miles. Her legs felt like water, and spots danced at the edges of her vision. "Easy now, big fellow." The voice came from somewhere behind, and to her left Thomas, speaking in the same calm tone he used with his horses. Sarah Beth didn't dare turn to look, but she heard his measured footsteps approaching. "Sarah Beth," he said quietly, "I need you to keep moving slowly toward your cabin. Don't run. Just Keep backing up nice and easy." The bear had stopped about 15 feet away, apparently more interested in Thomas than in her. She could see its nostrils flaring as it tested the air, trying to determine if these humans represented a threat. "That's it," Thomas continued, and she realized he was talking to her, not the bear. "Just keep going, you're doing fine." Her legs trembled with each step, but she managed to keep moving. The bear watched her retreat with what seemed like mild interest, then turned its full attention to Thomas. He stood perfectly still, one hand resting on something at his belt, probably a knife. Though what good a knife would do against an animal that size, Sarah Beth couldn't imagine. "You're not really interested in us, are you, friend?" Thomas said conversationally. "Just checking out the new neighbors." The bear snorted, a sound that could have been an agreement or threat. It took another step toward Thomas, close enough. Now that Sarah Beth could see the individual hairs in its massive coat, the powerful muscles moving beneath the fur, her cabin door was finally within reach. She fumbled for the latch, her hands shaking so badly she could barely manage the simple mechanism. The bear's head swung toward the sound, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought it might charge. Instead, it seemed to lose interest entirely. With a final snort, the animal turned and ambled back toward the forest, pausing only to investigate the fish remains once more before disappearing into the trees. Thomas remained motionless until the sounds of the bear's passage had faded completely. Only then did he turn toward Sarah Beth's cabin, his face pale beneath his tan. "Are you all right?" He called softly. Sarah Beth tried to answer, but no sound emerged. The delayed shock of the encounter hit her like a physical blow, and she sank onto the wooden step outside her door, her entire body shaking. Thomas approached slowly, as if she were a spooked animal herself. "It's over," he said gently. "You did exactly right. Bears are usually more curious than aggressive, but you never know." "I couldn't move," she whispered, finally finding her voice. "I was so frightened I couldn't even think. Fear's natural. The important thing is you didn't panic and run. That could have triggered a chase response." He settled onto the step beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "First bear?" She nodded, not trusting herself to speak again. The reality of how close she had come to serious injury or worse was beginning to sink in. "They're magnificent creatures," Thomas said, his voice carrying a note of genuine admiration. "Dangerous, yes, but worthy of respect." That one was. Probably just checking to see what changes had been made to his territory. "His territory?" Sarah Beth's voice rose slightly. "You mean he lives here? The whole mountain is his territory. We're the intruders from his perspective." Thomas seemed to realize this wasn't particularly comforting. "But he won't bother us. As long as we're careful about food storage and don't surprise him. Bears prefer to avoid humans when possible." The trembling in Sarah Beth's hands was beginning to subside, replaced by an odd mixture of exhilaration and embarrassment. She had survived her first real test of mountain life, but barely, and only because Thomas had been there to guide her through it. "Thank you," she said quietly. "If you hadn't been here." "But I was here." His voice carried a firmness that brooked no argument. "And from now on, you'll know what to do if it happens again." The simple confidence in his words sparked something unexpected in Sarah Beth's chest, not just gratitude, but a kind of pride. He didn't treat her encounter with the bear as evidence of her unsuitability for mountain life. Instead, he spoke as if it were simply part of her education, a necessary lesson learned. "I should have warned you more specifically about food storage," Thomas continued. "I cleaned fish by the stream yesterday and didn't dispose of the remains properly. That's what drew him here." "You're blaming yourself?" Sarah Beth stared at him in disbelief. "I'm the one who froze up like a frightened rabbit. You're the one who kept your head and didn't run." His green eyes met hers directly, and she saw nothing but sincerity there. That took real courage, especially for someone who's never faced a situation like that before. The unexpected praise made her cheeks warm. It had been so long since anyone had attributed courage to her actions that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen as capable rather than merely pitiable. "I didn't feel very courageous," she admitted. "Courage isn't the absence of fear," Thomas said. "It's doing what needs to be done despite the fear. You did that today." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the meadow where the bear had stood. The wildflowers swayed in the mountain breeze, and the stream continued its eternal murmur, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But something had shifted between them during those tense moments. Some barrier had been crossed without either of them quite realizing it. "There's something I need to ask you," Thomas said finally, his tone becoming more serious. "When I took this job, I thought I'd be working alone. Having you here... it changes things. I feel responsible for your safety, and that means I need to know I can count on you to follow instructions when it matters." Sarah Beth felt a flash of indignation. "Are you questioning my ability to—" "No," he interrupted gently. "I'm questioning my own judgment. Taking on this job when I knew there were risks was one thing when it was just me. But now—" He trailed off, running a hand through his dark hair. "I should have considered the dangers more carefully before agreeing to your employment." The admission surprised her. She had expected him to lecture her about mountain safety or suggest that perhaps town life would be more suitable for someone of her delicate constitution. Instead, he was questioning his own decisions. "Mr. Blackwood," she said carefully, "I knew there would be risks when I accepted this position. You were honest about the dangers. What happened today wasn't your fault, wasn't it? I left fish remains near the stream, essentially baiting a bear into our living area. That's exactly the kind of carelessness that gets people killed in the mountains." The genuine distress in his voice made Sarah Beth look at him more closely. There was something deeper here than simple concern for her safety, some weight of responsibility that went beyond their current situation. Has someone been hurt before because of your mistakes?" she asked softly. Thomas was quiet for so long that she thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "My wife and daughter died in an avalanche 3 years ago. I was supposed to be with them on that trip down to the valley, but I stayed behind to finish some work on our cabin. Told myself it was important, that they'd be fine without me." His hands clenched into fists. "If I'd been there, maybe I could have read the snow conditions better, chosen a different route. Maybe they'd still be alive." The raw pain in his admission made Sarah Beth's chest tighten with sympathy. She understood now why he had seemed so reluctant to take responsibility for another person's safety, why her presence here clearly troubled him despite the practical need for her help. "What were their names?" she asked gently. "Anna and Lucy. Anna was my wife. Lucy was our daughter. She was only 5. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Lucy loved the mountains as much as I did. Always wanted to climb higher, see what was over the next ridge. Anna used to say she got that from me." Sarah Beth sat quietly, recognizing the sacred nature of what he was sharing. The fact that he had trusted her with these names, these memories, felt like a gift of enormous value. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said finally. "But Mr. Blackwood, you can't carry the weight of every possible tragedy on your shoulders. Sometimes terrible things happen despite our best efforts." "Can't I?" His voice carried a bitter edge. "Seems like every time I let my guard down, someone pays the price. Is that why you live alone up here? To avoid the possibility of anyone else getting hurt?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Thomas looked out across the meadow, his expression troubled. "Partly," he admitted. "It's easier to be responsible for yourself. Easier, perhaps. But is it living?" The words escaped before Sarah Beth could stop them, surprising her with their boldness. But she pressed on, driven by an impulse she didn't fully understand. I spent 2 years after my accident trying to make myself small and invisible, convinced that if I didn't reach for anything, I couldn't lose it again. But that's not living, it's just existing. And sometimes existing isn't enough. Thomas turned to study her face, really seeing her for perhaps the first time since they'd met. His eyes traced the line of her scars without flinching, then met her gaze with an intensity that made her breath catch. "What changed your mind?" he asked quietly. Sarah Beth considered the question seriously. "Honestly, coming here. Taking this job. For the first time in years, I'm doing something that feels like moving forward instead of just hiding from the past. Even after today's scare, especially after today." She was surprised by the conviction in her own voice. "That bear could have killed me, but it didn't, and I didn't run. Maybe that means I'm stronger than I thought." A slow smile spread across Thomas's face, the first genuine expression of warmth she had seen from him. "You are stronger than you thought. Stronger than most people, I'd guess." The unexpected compliment made her heart skip, but she forced herself to remain practical. "Does that mean you're not going to try to send me back to town?" "No," he said firmly. "But it does mean we need to establish some safety protocols. And it means I need to stop treating you like you're made of spun glass. I'd appreciate that." Sarah Beth found herself smiling in return. "Though I reserve the right to be terrified of bears for a reasonable period of time, that's perfectly acceptable. I've been living in these mountains for years, and they still make me nervous." As they rose to return to their respective work, Sarah Beth felt something fundamental had shifted. The careful distance they had maintained for the past week had been shattered by a few moments of shared danger and honest conversation. She wasn't naive enough to think that a single encounter had created friendship, but it had created something understanding, perhaps, or at least mutual respect. "Sarah Beth," Thomas called as she reached her cabin door. She turned, surprised by his use of her first name. "If you ever feel unsafe, for any reason, don't hesitate to call for help. Promise me that." "I promise," she said solemnly. "And Thomas, thank you for trusting me with their names. Anna and Lucy, I'll remember them." His expression softened with something that might have been gratitude. "Thank you, that means more than you know." As Sarah Beth went back to her gardening, she found herself humming an old hymn her mother used to sing. The melody drifted across the meadow, mingling with the sound of Thomas's renewed hammering from the main house. For the first time since arriving in Colorado, she felt like she might actually belong here. The mountains had tested her and found her worthy. It was the beginning. The bear encounter marked a turning point in the rhythm of life at Henderson Place. Where once Thomas and Sarah Beth had maintained careful professional distance, they now found themselves naturally falling into a partnership born of necessity and growing mutual respect. Thomas began each morning by checking in with Sarah Beth, ostensibly to discuss the day's work, but really to ensure she had passed the night safely. These conversations, initially brief and businesslike, gradually lengthened as they discovered shared interests and complementary skills. "The main house is going to need a new roof before winter," Thomas mentioned on a crisp morning 2 weeks after the bear incident. He was examining a piece of damaged shingle, turning it over in his weathered hands. "Henderson patched it with whatever materials he could find, but it won't hold against a mountain winter." Sarah Beth looked up from where she was hanging laundry on the line she had strung between 2 pine trees. "How long does that give us?" The casual use of "us" surprised them both. Thomas paused in his examination of the shingle, and Sarah Beth felt a flush of embarrassment at her presumption. But when he answered, his tone was matter of fact. 6 weeks, maybe 8 if the weather holds. The supply run to Denver will take the better part of a week, and that's assuming the pass stays clear." He set the damaged wood aside and looked thoughtfully at the main house. "It's a big job for one person. Could I help?" The offer escaped before Sarah Beth could consider whether it was appropriate. She had been watching Thomas work for weeks now, fascinated by his methodical approach and obvious skill. "I'm stronger than I look, and I learn quickly." Thomas studied her for a moment, taking in her practical dress, the calluses that had already formed on her hands from household work, and the determined set of her jaw. Roofing is dangerous work. One wrong step and you could fall 20 feet onto rocky ground. "So could you," she pointed out. "Wouldn't it be safer to have someone to spot you, to hand you material so you don't have to climb up and down constantly?" The logic was sound, and they both knew it. Thomas nodded slowly. "I suppose it would be. But Sarah Beth, I meant what I said about the danger. If you're going to help with this, you follow my instructions exactly. No improvisation, no shortcuts." "Understood." She felt a thrill of excitement at the prospect of learning something entirely new, something that would make her genuinely useful rather than merely decorative. The next few days were spent in preparation. Thomas taught her to identify sound wood from rotting, to understand the principles of water flow and drainage that would keep the roof intact through mountain storms. He showed her how to handle tools safely, how to position her body for maximum leverage while maintaining balance. Sarah Beth proved to be an apt student. Her years of needlework had given her steady hands and an eye for precision, skills that translated surprisingly well to carpentry. More importantly, she listened carefully and asked intelligent questions, demonstrating the kind of thoughtful approach that Thomas valued. "You have good instincts for this work," he told her on the third day, after she had successfully measured and cut a series of support boards without supervision. "Most people rush the preparation, wanting to get to the visible progress. But the foundation work is what determines whether the whole project succeeds or fails." The unexpected praise warmed Sarah Beth more than she cared to admit. It had been years since anyone had complimented her competence rather than offering sympathy for her limitations. "My father always said that any job worth doing was worth doing well," she replied. "Though I don't think he ever imagined me applying that principle to roofing." "What did he imagine you doing?" Thomas asked as he selected the next board to cut. Sarah Beth paused in her sorting of nails, considering how to answer. "The usual things for a young lady of modest means. Marriage to a suitable gentleman, raising children, managing a household. Simple aspirations, and the fire changed all that." It wasn't a question, and Sarah Beth appreciated that he didn't try to soften the reality with platitudes about how things might still work out. "The fire changed everything," she agreed. "Not just my appearance, but people's expectations of what my life could be. Suddenly I went from being a young woman with prospects to being an object of pity." Thomas set down his saw and looked at her directly. "Is that how you see yourself? As an object of pity?" The question caught her off guard. She had grown so accustomed to other people's reactions that she had stopped considering her own self-perception. "I used to," she said slowly, "but lately, I'm not sure. When I'm working on something like this, learning new skills, accomplishing things I never thought I could do, it's hard to feel pitiful." "Good," Thomas said simply, "because there's nothing pitiful about you. Scarred, yes, but scars are just evidence that you survived something that could have killed you. That takes strength." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. They heard hoofbeats approaching long before the rider came into view, giving them time to wonder who might be venturing so far from town. The man who emerged from the tree line was a stranger to both of them, middle-aged, well-dressed in city clothes that looked out of place in the mountain setting. He rode with the careful posture of someone unaccustomed to long hours in the saddle. "Good morning," he called as he approached. "I'm looking for Thomas Blackwood." "That's me, Thomas," replied, his tone cautious. Unexpected visitors in the mountains usually meant trouble of one kind or another. The stranger dismounted somewhat stiffly and approached with an extended hand. "Nathan Hartwell, from the Territorial Land Office in Denver. I apologize for arriving unannounced, but there's been a development regarding this property that requires immediate attention. Sarah Beth felt her stomach drop. In her experience, official visits rarely brought good news. She glanced at Thomas and saw her own concern reflected in his expression. "What kind of development?" Thomas asked, accepting the handshake but maintaining his wary tone. Hartwell reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a leather portfolio. "I'm afraid there's been an error in the property records. The sale of this land to your employer was completed before we discovered that Henrik Henderson never actually held clear title to the mineral rights." "What does that mean, exactly?" Sarah Beth found herself asking, despite having no official role in the conversation. Hartwell looked at her with mild surprise, as if he hadn't expected a woman to involve herself in business matters. "It means that while the surface rights were validly sold, the subsurface rights, the rights to any minerals that might be found here, belong to someone else. And that someone has just filed a claim to work this land." Thomas was very still, the way Sarah Beth had learned he became when processing unwelcome information. "Who filed the claim?" "A mining consortium from back east. They've apparently been buying up mineral rights throughout this region, betting that new extraction techniques will make previously unprofitable claims worth working." Hartwell consulted his papers. "They have the legal right to access this property for mining operations, which could significantly interfere with any other activities here. What does that mean for us?" Sarah Beth asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew the answer. "Well, miss, I'm not sure what your arrangement is here, but I'm afraid Mr. Blackwood's employment situation may be about to change dramatically." Hartwell turned back to Thomas. "Your employer will need to decide whether to continue with restoration work under these new circumstances, or whether to cut his losses and abandon the project." Thomas absorbed this information with characteristic stoicism, but Sarah Beth could see the tension in his shoulders, the tightening around his eyes that spoke of deeper worry. "How long do we have?" Thomas asked. "The mining consortium is required to give 30 days notice before beginning operations. That notice was filed yesterday." Hartwell tucked the papers back into his portfolio. "I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news. The territorial government is trying to sort out these title issues, but it's a complicated mess that could take years to resolve." After Hartwell left, Thomas and Sarah Beth stood in the meadow, contemplating the implications of this development. The roof they had been planning suddenly seemed pointless. The careful work of restoration, the gradual transformation of the abandoned homestead into something livable again, all of it might be swept away by forces entirely beyond their control. "What will you do?" Sarah Beth asked quietly. Thomas looked around the property with an expression of deep sadness. "I suppose I'll have to contact my employer and explain the situation. He may decide to fight the mining consortium in court, but that could take years and cost a fortune. More likely, he'll cut his losses and find another property to develop, and then I'll be looking for work again. There's always demand for skilled carpenters, especially with winter coming on. People need repairs done before the snow flies." Sarah Beth nodded, trying to process what this meant for her own situation. Without the restoration project, there would be no need for her services here. She would be back where she started, stranded in a strange place with limited options and dwindling resources. But to her surprise, the prospect didn't fill her with the same despair she might have felt a month ago. The weeks of physical work, of learning new skills and proving her competence, had restored something in her that she hadn't realized was missing. She was no longer the broken woman who had arrived in Timber Falls with nothing but charity and false hopes. "Thomas," she said, the use of his first name feeling natural now. "Whatever happens with this property, I want you to know that these weeks here have meant more to me than you probably realize. You've helped me remember who I am beneath these scars." He turned to look at her, and she was surprised by the intensity of his gaze. "You've done the same for me," he said quietly. "I'd forgotten what it was like to work alongside someone, to share the satisfaction of building something worthwhile. Anna used to help me with projects like this. I thought that part of my life was over." The admission hung between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Sarah Beth felt her heart rate quicken as she recognized something in his expression that went beyond mere gratitude for her assistance. "Maybe it doesn't have to be over," she said softly. Thomas stepped closer, close enough that she could see. The gold flecks in his green eyes, could smell the pine sap on his work clothes. "Sarah Beth, I need you to know that whatever happens with this job, whatever we decide to do next, it won't be because I pity you or because you have nowhere else to go. It would be because ... double quotes. He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Because..." "What?" she whispered. "Because somewhere in the past few weeks, you've become important to me. Not as an employee, not as someone who needs protection, but as a partner, someone I trust and respect and..." He stopped, running a hand through his dark hair. "I'm not saying this well." Sarah Beth reached out tentatively and touched his arm. "You're saying it perfectly." The contact seemed to give him courage. "I'm saying that if we have to leave this place, I'd like you to come with me. Not as my employee, but as, well, as whatever you'd be willing to be." The careful phrasing touched her heart. Even in this moment of emotional honesty, he was giving her the choice, making it clear that he expected nothing and would accept whatever decision she made. "I'd be willing to be your partner," she said simply. "In work, in life, in whatever comes next." The smile that spread across Thomas's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He reached up to touch her scarred cheek gently, his thumb tracing the twisted skin with infinite tenderness. "These don't define you, you know," he said softly. "They're part of your story, but they're not the end of it. I'm beginning to understand." "That," she replied, leaning into his touch. "But it took coming here, working beside you, to really believe it." They stood together in the meadow as the afternoon light began to slant golden through the pine trees. The future was uncertain. They might have to leave this beautiful place, might have to start over once again in some new location, but for the first time since the fire, Sarah Beth felt truly hopeful about what lay ahead. Whatever challenges they would face them together. And that, she realized, made all the difference. The sound of hammering resumed the next morning, steady and purposeful despite the uncertain future. They had decided to continue the roofing project, partly because Thomas's employer deserved to have the work completed as contracted, but mostly because they had found meaning in the shared labor that went beyond mere employment. "Even if we have to leave," Thomas had said over breakfast, "at least we'll know we finished what we started. That matters." Sarah Beth agreed completely. There was satisfaction in completing a job well done, regardless of whether they would be there to enjoy the results. More than that, there was something deeply right about working together toward a common goal, about the easy communication that had developed between them as they moved in sync across the roof. As she handed him the next bundle of shingles, Sarah Beth reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just a few weeks. She had arrived in Colorado as a refugee from her own past, convinced that her best days were behind her. Now, balanced on a mountain rooftop beside a man who saw her as a partner rather than a burden, she felt more alive than she had in years. The future might be uncertain, but it was theirs to write together. And that was more than she had dared to hope for when she first stepped off the stagecoach in Timber Falls. The work continued, each nail driven with care, each shingle placed with precision. They were building more than just a roof. They were building a foundation for whatever came next. The mining consortium arrived exactly 30 days after Nathan Hartwell's visit, rolling into the Henderson meadow with a convoy of wagons that seemed to swallow the tranquil landscape whole. Sarah Beth watched from her cabin window as a dozen men in dusty work clothes began unloading equipment with the efficiency of a military operation. Steam-powered drilling apparatus, timber for supports, or barrels of what she assumed were blasting materials. The peaceful valley was being transformed into an industrial site before her eyes. The man in charge was a tall, angular figure named Cyrus Brennan, who introduced himself to Thomas with the casual authority of someone accustomed to getting his way. Sarah Beth hung back during their initial conversation, but she could hear Brennan's voice clearly across the morning air, confident, dismissive, and utterly without concern for how his operations might affect the existing inhabitants. "We'll be setting up operations near the old mine shaft first," Brennan was explaining to Thomas, gesturing toward the hillside behind the main house. "The geological surveys suggest that Henderson barely scratched the surface of what's down there. With modern extraction techniques, this could be one of the richest silver veins in the territory." Thomas's response was measured but firm. "Mr. Brennan, I understand you have legal rights here, but there are people living on this property. We need to establish some basic safety protocols and communication procedures." Brennan's laugh was harsh and dismissive. "Mr. Blackwood, with all due respect, what you need to do is understand that this is a mining operation now, not a homestead. We'll take reasonable precautions, but if you're not comfortable with industrial activity, perhaps you should consider relocating." The casual suggestion that they simply abandon their home, for that was what the Henderson place had become, regardless of the legal technicalities, sparked a flame of anger in Sarah Beth's chest. She had spent too many years being told that her comfort and safety were secondary concerns to tolerate it again without protest. Before she could reconsider the wisdom of her actions, she found herself walking toward the two men, her chin raised, in a gesture of defiance that would have been familiar to anyone who knew her before the fire. "Excuse me, Mr. Brennan," she said, her voice carrying the crisp authority she had learned in Boston drawing rooms. "I believe there may be some misunderstanding about the situation here." Brennan turned to look at her with the kind of casual dismissal she had grown to hate his eyes taking in her carefully arranged hair, her practical dress, and yes, the visible scarring on her face. She saw his expression shift from mild interest to something approaching pity, and her resolve hardened. "Ma'am," he said with exaggerated courtesy, "I'm sure this is all very confusing for you, but this is really a matter for the men to sort out." The condescending tone was like a match to tinder. Sarah Beth felt 3 years of accumulated frustration and suppressed anger crystallize into diamond-hard determination. "Mr. Brennan, I may be a woman, but I'm not confused. I understand perfectly well that you have mineral rights to this property. What I don't understand is why you seem to think that gives you the right to endanger the people who live here without even the courtesy of a conversation about safety measures." Thomas stepped closer to her, and she could feel his support like a physical presence. The knowledge that he wouldn't try to silence her or apologize for her boldness gave her the courage to continue. "Furthermore," she continued, "if you're planning to use blasting techniques near occupied buildings, I believe territorial law requires you to provide advance notice and take measures to protect existing structures. I assume you've reviewed those regulations?" Brennan's expression had shifted from condescension to surprised annoyance. Clearly, he hadn't expected to be challenged on legal technicalities by a scarred woman in a remote mountain valley. "I'm sure our legal team has reviewed all applicable regulations," he said stiffly. "I'm sure they have," Sarah Beth replied smoothly. "But since those regulations are designed to protect people like us, I think it would be appropriate for you to share the specifics of your safety protocols. After all, if something were to go wrong, if, for instance, a blast were to damage the main house or cause a landslide that blocked the only access road, we would all find ourselves in a very difficult situation." The mention of the access road seemed to catch Brennan's attention. Sarah Beth had spent enough time exploring the property to know that there was only one practical route in and out of the valley, and that a significant rockfall could easily block it for weeks or even months. She suspected that Brennan's mining equipment had arrived by that same route, and that his entire operation depended on maintaining access to the outside world. "What exactly are you proposing?" Brennan asked, his tone suggesting that he was beginning to take her more seriously. "I'm proposing a meeting," Sarah Beth said simply. "Tonight, after your men have finished setting up their initial equipment. You can explain your planned operations. We can share our knowledge of local conditions, and we can establish protocols that protect everyone's interests." Thomas was looking at her with an expression of mixed admiration and amazement. She suspected that her transformation from timid employee to confident negotiator was as surprising to him as it was to her. But the weeks of physical work, of proving her competence and building her confidence, had awakened something in her that she thought the fire had destroyed forever: the ability to stand up for herself and fight for what mattered to her. Brennan considered the proposal for several moments, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he nodded curtly. "Very well. 7 o'clock tonight at the main house. But I want to be clear that this is a courtesy, not a negotiation. We have legal rights here, and we intend to exercise them." "Of course," Sarah Beth agreed. "But rights exercised with consideration for others tend to encounter fewer obstacles than rights exercised without it." After Brennan stalked away to supervise his workers, Thomas turned to Sarah Beth with an expression of frank admiration. "Where did that come from?" he asked, though his tone suggested he was pleased rather than concerned. Sarah Beth felt a flush of pride mixed with surprise at her own boldness. "I'm not entirely sure, but I realized that I was tired of being treated like my opinions don't matter, just because I don't look the way people expect me to." "You were magnificent," Thomas said simply. Brennan had no idea what hit him. The praise warmed her, but Sarah Beth was already thinking ahead to the evening's meeting. She had bought them time and established that they wouldn't be simply pushed aside, but the real work was still ahead of them. "Thomas," she said, "we need to prepare for tonight. If we're going to protect our position here, we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with." They spent the afternoon observing the mining operation and researching everything they could remember about territorial mining laws. Thomas proved to have a surprising knowledge of legal technicalities, gleaned from his years of working on various development projects throughout the region. "The key," he explained as they reviewed their notes, "is that mineral rights don't supersede basic safety requirements. They have to operate within the same legal framework as any other industrial activity." Sarah Beth nodded, adding her own observations. "And they're clearly planning a major operation. I counted at least 3 steam drilling rigs, and those barrels they unloaded are almost certainly blasting powder. This isn't going to be a small-scale mining effort." As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that Brennan's operation was even more extensive than they had initially realized. More wagons arrived, bringing additional workers and increasingly sophisticated equipment. By evening, the peaceful mountain valley had been transformed into something resembling a small industrial city. The meeting that night took place in the main room of the Henderson house, with Brennan and his foreman, a grizzled man named Murphy, representing the mining consortium. Sarah Beth had arranged chairs around the large wooden table, creating a formal setting that emphasized the serious nature of their discussion. Brennan began by outlining his planned operations with the kind of technical detail that was clearly intended to overwhelm and intimidate. He spoke of shaft depths and ore extraction rates, of chemical processing techniques and transportation logistics. It was an impressive display of industrial planning, but Sarah Beth listened with growing concern for what it would mean for their little valley. "The initial excavation will require significant blasting," Brennan explained, pointing to a hand-drawn map of the property. "We'll be following the main vein here, which runs roughly parallel to the existing structures. With proper precautions, there shouldn't be any danger to the buildings." "What constitutes proper precautions?" Thomas asked. Murphy, the foreman, answered with the practical tone of a man who had supervised such operations before. Standard blast shields, timed detonations to minimize ground shock, constant monitoring of structural integrity. We've done this kind of work before. But not in a location where people are living directly adjacent to the mining operation, Sarah Beth pointed out. Most industrial mining takes place in areas that have been cleared of residential structures. Brennan's expression suggested that he found her continued involvement in the conversation annoying. Miss, I'm sorry, I don't believe I caught your name. Williams, Sarah Beth Williams. Miss Williams, I appreciate your concern, but I can assure you that we are fully capable of conducting our operations safely. I'm sure you are, Sarah Beth replied evenly. But I think it would be prudent to establish specific safety protocols rather than relying on general assurances. She opened the notebook where she had been recording her observations throughout the day. For instance, I noticed that your planned blast site is approximately 200 yards from the main house. According to territorial safety regulations, blasting operations within 500 yards of occupied structures require advance notification and the opportunity for residents to evacuate during detonation. Brennan and Murphy exchanged glances, clearly surprised by her specific knowledge of the regulations. Furthermore, Sarah Beth continued, the access road that you used to bring in your equipment passes directly beneath the area where you plan to conduct your deepest excavations. If your blasting were to cause a rockfall that blocked that road, it could strand everyone in this valley for months. What exactly are you proposing? Brennan asked, his tone suggesting grudging respect for her preparation. Thomas leaned forward, taking over the conversation with the easy confidence that Sarah Beth had come to admire. We're proposing a formal safety agreement, advance notice of all blasting operations, inspection of critical structures before and after major excavations, and a commitment to maintain access to the valley at all times. And if we agree to these terms? Brennan asked. Then you'll have our cooperation instead of our opposition, Sarah Beth said simply. We understand that you have legal rights here, but we also have legal rights as residents. We can work together. Or we can spend the next several months dealing with territorial officials and safety inspectors. The implied threat was delivered with such calm reasonableness that it took Brennan a moment to fully grasp its implications. When he did, his expression darkened considerably. Are you threatening to interfere with our legal operations? Not at all, Thomas replied smoothly. We're simply pointing out that territorial law requires mining operations to comply with safety regulations, and that residents have the right to request inspections if they have reasonable concerns about compliance. The room fell silent as Brennan considered their position. Sarah Beth could see him weighing the potential delays and complications of a protracted legal dispute against the miner, inconvenience of accommodating their safety concerns. Finally, he nodded curtly. Very well. We'll provide 24 hours notice before any major blasting operations. You'll have the opportunity to inspect your structures and evacuate if you choose. But I want your word that you won't interfere with our operations beyond these basic safety measures. Agreed, Sarah Beth said immediately, extending her hand across the table. Brennan shook it with obvious reluctance, but the gesture formalized their understanding. As the miners filed out of the house, Sarah Beth felt a surge of triumph mixed with exhaustion. They had won a significant victory, but she suspected it was only the first of many battles to come. That was extraordinary, Thomas said once they were alone. I've never seen anyone handle a negotiation like that. Sarah Beth sank into one of the chairs, suddenly feeling the weight of what they had accomplished. I learned from watching my father deal with difficult customers at his shop. He always said that the key to negotiation was being prepared and staying calm, no matter how much the other person tried to rattle you. Well, you certainly rattled Brennan. I don't think he expected to encounter that level of preparation from A woman in a remote mountain valley. The observation touched on something that had been bothering Sarah Beth throughout the encounter. "Thomas, did you notice how he kept trying to dismiss me? As if my opinions didn't matter because I'm a woman, or because of my scars." Thomas nodded grimly. "I noticed. But I also noticed that by the end of the meeting, he was taking you very seriously indeed. You proved that his initial assumptions were wrong." "It felt good," Sarah Beth admitted. "Standing up for myself, for us, for this place. I haven't felt that confident in years." Thomas reached across the table and took her hand. "You should feel confident. What you did tonight was remarkable. You probably saved us months of dangerous conditions and legal battles." As they sat together in the quiet house, listening to the distant sounds of the mining camp settling in for the night, Sarah Beth reflected on how much she had changed since arriving in Colorado. The frightened, broken woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Timber Falls seemed like a different person entirely. The fire had taken so much from her appearance, her social standing, her confidence in her own worth. But here in this remote mountain valley, working alongside a man who saw her as an equal partner, she had found something she hadn't even realized she was looking for: herself. Whatever challenges lay ahead with the mining operation, whatever uncertainty still clouded their future, Sarah Beth knew that she was no longer the same woman who had been victimized by a cruel deception. She was someone who could stand up for herself and fight for what mattered to her. And that transformation, she realized, was worth more than all the silver that might be hidden in the mountain. The first month of coexistence with the mining operation tested every agreement they had negotiated. True to his word, Brennan provided advance notice of blasting operations, but the reality of living adjacent to an industrial mining site proved more challenging than any of them had anticipated. The constant noise of steam engines and drilling equipment shattered the mountain silence, while clouds of dust from the excavation work settled over everything like a fine gray shroud. Sarah Beth adapted with characteristic determination, developing routines to protect their living spaces and maintain some semblance of normal life. She learned to time her outdoor work around the mining schedule, to secure loose items before blast operations, and to read the subtle signs that indicated when the miners were preparing for particularly disruptive activities. Thomas, meanwhile, found his construction work constantly complicated by the vibrations from mining equipment. The careful measurements and precise joints that defined quality carpentry became nearly impossible when the ground shook regularly from nearby excavations. More than once, he had to disassemble and rebuild sections of work that had been thrown out of alignment by particularly powerful blasts. But it was during the third week of October that their uneasy coexistence faced its greatest test. Sarah Beth was in her cabin, preparing breakfast, when she heard an unusual sound from the direction of the mining operation. Not the usual rhythmic pounding of machinery, but shouts of alarm and the high-pitched whistle that signaled an emergency. She rushed outside to see miners running toward the main shaft, their faces etched with panic. Through the morning mist she could see steam or smoke rising from the excavation site, though she couldn't determine which. Thomas appeared from the main house, his expression grim. "Something's wrong at the mine. That's their emergency signal." They hurried toward the mining camp, where they found chaos. Murphy, the foreman, was shouting orders to workers who seemed to be pulling equipment away from the main shaft. Brennan stood near a makeshift table covered with geological charts, his usual composure replaced by obvious agitation. "What's happened?" Thomas called out as they approached. Murphy looked up, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. "Hit an underground spring. The whole lower level is flooding, and we can't get the pumps working fast enough to stay ahead of it." Sarah Beth felt her stomach clench with a familiar dread. Water and industrial operations were a dangerous combination, especially in underground spaces. The mill fire that had changed her life had been caused partly by inadequate water pressure. For firefighting, She understood how quickly industrial disasters could spiral out of control. "Is anyone trapped down there?" she asked. "Not yet," Murphy replied, "but we've got 3 men trying to salvage equipment from the lower levels. If the water keeps rising at this rate, the whole shaft could collapse." Brennan looked up from his charts with an expression of frustrated desperation. The geological surveys didn't indicate any significant water sources at this depth. "We're completely unprepared for this volume of flow." Thomas studied the situation with the practical eye of someone who had dealt with mountain water sources for years. "Where exactly did you hit the spring?" Murphy led them to the edge of the shaft, where they could see muddy water rising steadily. Despite the efforts of 2 steam-powered pumps, the sound of rushing water echoed from the depths, suggesting a substantial underground flow. "About 40 feet down, in the eastern branch of the main tunnel," Murphy explained. "Hit it with a blast 2 hours ago, and it's been flowing ever since." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "That's probably connected to the stream that runs through the property." Underground water systems in these mountains can be complex. What looks like a small surface creek might be fed by extensive underground sources. "Can it be stopped?" Brennan asked, his voice carrying a note of desperation that Sarah Beth had never heard before. "Maybe," Thomas replied, "but not with conventional mining techniques. You'd need to approach it more like building a dam than excavating a mine." Sarah Beth found herself studying the problem with the same analytical approach she had applied to their safety negotiations. The miners were clearly out of their depth. Their expertise lay in extracting materials from dry ground, not in managing large-scale water flow. But Thomas understood mountain water systems, and she had spent enough time observing the property to have insights about local drainage patterns. "Thomas," she said quietly, "remember what you told me about the Henderson family's irrigation system? How Henrik had diverted part of the stream to water his crops?" Thomas's eyes lit up with understanding. "The old diversion channel. It's been abandoned for years, but if we could reactivate it, we might be able to redirect the underground flow away from the mining operation." Sarah Beth finished. Brennan had been following their conversation with growing interest. "Are you saying you know how to stop the flooding?" "We're saying we might know how to redirect it," Thomas corrected. "But it would require cooperation between your operation and ours. And it would mean suspending mining activities while we work on the water management system." The suggestion clearly didn't sit well with Brennan, who was obviously calculating the cost of further delays. But as another shout from the miners indicated that the water level was still rising, his expression shifted to resigned acceptance. "What would you need from us?" he asked. Sarah Beth stepped forward, her confidence bolstered by their previous successful negotiation. "Access to your engineering equipment, pulleys, cables, steam power for heavy lifting, and workers who can follow instructions precisely, even if they don't understand the overall plan. And in return, if we can solve your flooding problem, you agree to modify your mining operations to work around the natural water systems instead of fighting them," Thomas said. "It might mean less intensive excavation, but it would also mean more sustainable operations with fewer risks of future flooding." Brennan considered this for several moments while the sounds of the emergency continued around them. Finally, he nodded. "If you can stop this flooding and get us back to productive mining, we'll consider operational modifications." What followed was the most intense collaboration of Sarah Beth's life. Working with Thomas and Murphy, she helped develop a plan to reactivate Henrik Henderson's old irrigation system while simultaneously creating new drainage channels to redirect the underground spring flow. The work required every skill she had developed during her weeks in the mountains, and several she had to learn on the spot. She found herself calculating water flow rates, designing temporary dams, and coordinating teams of workers whose experience with mining equipment proved invaluable for moving large amounts of earth and stone. "The key," Thomas explained to the assembled workers, is to think of water like any other force of nature. You can't fight it directly, but you can guide it where you want it to go. Sarah Beth added her own insights, drawn from years of managing household systems and her recent crash course in mountain drainage. Water always follows the path of least resistance. Our job is to make sure that path leads away from the mining operation and toward areas where it can be beneficial. The actual construction took 3 days of non-stop work. Sarah Beth found herself working alongside miners who initially regarded her with skepticism, but gradually came to respect her practical knowledge and tireless dedication. Her scarred face, which had once made her an object of pity or avoidance, became simply another feature among workers whose own faces bore the marks of dangerous labor. Thomas proved to be a natural leader for the mixed crew of miners and construction workers. His combination of technical knowledge and diplomatic skill kept the project moving forward, even when disagreements arose about methods or priorities. "You were right about the underground flow patterns," Murphy admitted to Sarah Beth. On the second day, as they watched water beginning to flow through their newly constructed channels. "I've been mining for 20 years, and I never would have thought to approach a flooding problem this way." "Different problems require different solutions," Sarah Beth replied. "The important thing is being willing to listen to people who understand different aspects of the situation." By the evening of the third day, their improvised water management system was functioning. The flooding in the mine shaft had been stopped. The underground spring had been redirected to feed into the existing stream system, and the miners were able to resume their excavation work on a modified schedule that respected the natural water flow patterns, but the true measure of their success became apparent only in the weeks that followed. The redirected water flow created new opportunities for both operations. The mining work could proceed safely in areas that were naturally dry, while the enhanced stream flow improved the water supply for both the main house and Sarah Beth's cabin. More importantly, the collaboration had fundamentally changed the relationship between the mining operation and the residential occupants of the property. Brennan, who had initially viewed Thomas and Sarah Beth as obstacles to be managed or removed, now consulted them regularly on operational decisions that might affect the broader property. "I have to admit," he told them during a weekly planning meeting that had become routine, "your approach to problem solving is more sophisticated than I initially realized. We could have saved ourselves considerable trouble if we'd involved you in the planning from the beginning." Sarah Beth exchanged a meaningful look with Thomas. The admission represented a complete reversal of Brennan's initial dismissive attitude. But more than that, it represented recognition of their competence and value as partners, rather than merely obstacles. "We all learned something from this experience," Thomas replied diplomatically. "Sometimes the best solutions come from combining different types of expertise." As autumn progressed toward winter, the Henderson property settled into a new rhythm that accommodated both mining operations and residential life. The safety protocols they had negotiated were scrupulously observed, the water management system continued to function effectively, and the two operations had found ways to be mutually beneficial rather than mutually destructive. For Sarah Beth, the transformation was profound on multiple levels. Not only had she proven her competence in a crisis situation, but she had also discovered a talent for engineering and project management that she never knew she possessed. The work had challenged her intellectually in ways that her previous life had never offered, and she found herself energized by the complexity of the problems they were solving. "You know," Thomas said one evening as they sat on the porch of the main house, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, "I think we've found something here that neither of us was looking for when we started." "What's that?" Sarah Beth asked, though she suspected she knew what he meant. "A way to be useful that goes beyond just surviving. A way to solve problems that matter, to build something that makes life better for other people." He paused, studying her profile in the evening light. "You've become quite the engineer, you know." Sarah Beth laughed, a sound of pure joy that seemed to echo off the mountain peaks. I never imagined myself designing water management systems or negotiating with mining consortiums. A year ago, my biggest challenge was deciding which dress to wear to social calls. Do you miss it? That life? The question was one she had been pondering more frequently as winter approached and their future became more certain. The answer, when it came, surprised her with its clarity. No, she said simply. I miss some of the people, my mother, especially. But I don't miss the constraints, the expectations, the sense that my value was determined entirely by how well I met other people's definitions of what I should be. Thomas reached over and took her hand, his calloused palm warm against her scarred fingers. And now? Now I feel like I'm finally becoming who I was meant to be, scars and all. As the first snow of winter began to fall, dusting the mountains with pristine white, Sarah Beth reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had come to Colorado as a refugee from her own past, seeking nothing more than a place to hide from the world's judgment. Instead, she found a place where her judgment mattered, where her skills were valued, where her partnership was not just welcome but essential. The mail-order bride deception that had brought her west had been cruel and devastating. But it had also been, in its own way, a gift. It had forced her to discover strengths she didn't know she possessed, to forge relationships based on mutual respect rather than social convention, and to build a life that was authentically her own. Looking ahead to whatever challenges the coming winter might bring, Sarah Beth felt a confidence that had nothing to do with her appearance and everything to do with her capabilities. She had proven to herself and to others that she was more than the sum of her scars, more than a victim of circumstances beyond her control. She was a partner, a problem solver, a woman who could hold her own in any situation that required intelligence, determination, and courage. And that, she realized, was worth more than any conventional notion of beauty or social acceptability. The mountains had tested her and found her worthy. Now it was time to see what other challenges and opportunities lay ahead. The first blizzard of winter arrived 3 weeks earlier than expected, transforming the mountain valley into a crystalline world of pristine beauty and practical challenges. Sarah Beth woke to absolute silence, the kind of profound quiet that only comes when snow has muffled every sound, and the world has been temporarily suspended beneath a blanket of white. From her cabin window, she could see that the storm had deposited nearly 2 feet of snow overnight, effectively isolating the valley from the outside world until the spring thaw. The mining operation had ceased completely, with Brennan and his crew settling into the winter quarters they had constructed near their equipment. The enforced hibernation would give everyone time to rest, plan, and reflect on the extraordinary events of the past few months. Thomas appeared at her door shortly after sunrise, his dark hair dusted with snowflakes and his green eyes bright with excitement rather than concern. "Well," he said with a grin that reminded her of a schoolboy on an unexpected holiday, "it looks like we're officially snowed in until spring. I hope you're prepared for several months of very close quarters with your business partner." The easy reference to their partnership warmed Sarah Beth more than the coffee she was brewing. Over the months of working together, their relationship had evolved into something that defied simple categorization. They were business partners, certainly, but also friends, confidants, and something more that neither of them had yet found the courage to name explicitly. "I think I can manage," she replied with mock solemnity. "Though you should know that I've been planning some improvements to the main house that will require your carpentry expertise." "Improvements?" Sarah Beth led him to the kitchen table where she had spread out hand-drawn plans that represented weeks of careful observation and planning. "The water management system we built for the mining operation gave me ideas about how we could improve the domestic systems as well. Better drainage, more efficient heating, expanded storage space." Thomas studied her sketches with growing admiration. The plans were detailed and practical, showing a sophisticated understanding of both engineering principles and the specific challenges of mountain living. Sarah Beth, these are remarkable. Where did you learn to design systems like this? From watching you work mostly. And from necessity, I've been thinking about how to make this place more livable. She paused, suddenly uncertain about how to finish the sentence. For the long term? Thomas supplied gently. She nodded, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. The assumption of a shared future had been implicit in many of their recent conversations, but neither of them had addressed it directly. The enforced isolation of winter seemed to demand more honesty about their intentions and expectations. Thomas, she said carefully, we should probably discuss what we're planning for the spring. Whether you'll be staying here, whether there will still be work for me, whether we're going to continue pretending that we're just business partners. Thomas interrupted, his voice carrying a warmth that made her heart race. Sarah Beth looked up from her sketches to find him watching her with an expression of such tenderness that it took her breath away. The careful distance they had maintained, even through all their collaboration and shared challenges, suddenly seemed artificial and unnecessary. Sarah Beth, Thomas continued, moving closer to her chair, I need you to know that what we've built here goes far beyond any professional arrangement. You've become essential to my life in ways I never expected. The words hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Sarah Beth felt 3 years of accumulated defenses beginning to crumble, replaced by a hope so fragile and precious that she was almost afraid to acknowledge it. I feel the same way, she whispered. But Thomas, I need you to understand what you're considering. I'm not the woman I was before the fire. I may never be able to give you the kind of life that— Stop. Thomas reached out to touch her scarred cheek with infinite gentleness. Sarah Beth, look at me. She raised her eyes to meet him, seeing nothing but love and acceptance in their green depths. The woman you were before the fire is not the woman I fell in love with, he said simply. I fell in love with the woman who stood up to Cyrus Brennan, who engineered a solution to save a mining operation, who turned a business negotiation into a partnership that benefits everyone involved. I fell in love with your courage, your intelligence, your determination to build something meaningful despite everything you've endured. The words washed over her like warm rain after a long drought. For the first time since the mill fire, someone was telling her that her scars didn't diminish her value, that they were simply part of the story of who she had become. Thomas, she began, but he wasn't finished. I know you think your appearance makes you somehow less worthy of love, but Sarah Beth, when I look at you, I see the most beautiful woman I've ever known. Beautiful because of your strength, because of your kindness, because of the way you face every challenge with grace and determination. Tears were streaming down her face now, tears of relief, of joy, of a kind of healing she hadn't dared to hope for. The careful shell she had built around her heart was cracking open, letting in light she had thought was lost forever. I love you too, she whispered. I have for weeks, but I was so afraid. Afraid of what? Afraid that if I let myself hope for this for us, it would be taken away again. Afraid that I was being foolish to think that someone could love me as I am now. Thomas pulled her into his arms, holding her close while she cried out years of accumulated pain and self-doubt. When her tears finally subsided, he tilted her chin up so she could see his face. Sarah Beth Williams, he said solemnly, will you marry me? Not because you need protection or because I need a housekeeper, but because I want to spend the rest of my life building something extraordinary with the most remarkable woman I've ever known. The proposal was so perfectly suited to who they had become together that Sarah Beth laughed through her lingering tears. Yes, she said without hesitation. Yes, Thomas Blackwood, I will marry you. And I want to build something extraordinary too. They were married 3 days later in a ceremony that was as unconventional as their courtship had been. With the valley snowed in and no minister available, they exchanged vows in front of the stone fireplace of the main house, with Cyrus Brennan serving as witness and Murphy offering a blessing in the Irish tradition of his childhood. Sarah Beth wore her best dress, a simple blue wool that brought out the color of her eyes, with her hair arranged in a style that didn't hide her scars, but didn't emphasize them either. She had stopped trying to make herself invisible, accepting Thomas's assertion that her worth had nothing to do with conventional notions of beauty. Do you, Thomas Blackwood, take Sarah Beth Williams to be your wife, your partner, and your equal in all things? Brennan asked, reading from a book of legal ceremonies he had found among the mining company's supplies. I do, Thomas replied, his voice carrying across the room with complete certainty. And do you, Sarah Beth Williams, take Thomas Blackwood to be your husband, your partner, and your equal in all things? I do, Sarah Beth said, feeling the words resonate through her entire being. They had no rings to exchange, but Thomas had carved 2 wooden bands from mountain oak, simple and strong like their love. As they slipped them onto each other's fingers, Sarah Beth felt a completeness she had never experienced before. Not just the joy of being loved, but the deeper satisfaction of being truly known and accepted. The wedding celebration was modest but joyful, with Murphy contributing a bottle of Irish whiskey he had been saving for a special occasion, and several of the miners offering toasts that ranged from sentimental to hilariously inappropriate. Even Brennan, who had initially seemed incapable of viewing their relationship as anything but a business inconvenience, raised his glass with genuine warmth. To Thomas and Sarah Beth, he said formally, who taught us all that the most valuable partnerships are built on mutual respect and shared purpose. As winter deepened around their valley sanctuary, the newlyweds settled into a domestic rhythm that felt both natural and miraculous. They spent their days working on the house improvement Sarah Beth had designed, turning the Henderson place into a true home that reflected their combined vision for the future. The evenings were spent by the fire, planning not just for the coming spring, but for the years beyond. Thomas had received word through the mining company's communications that his former employer wanted to hire him for another restoration project, but now their response would be different. We could take on projects together, Sarah Beth suggested one snowy evening as they reviewed the offer. You handle the construction and carpentry, I handle the project management and client relations. We could build a reputation as a team that specializes in challenging restoration work. Thomas looked up from the letter with eyes full of admiration. You want to turn this into a business partnership as well as a marriage? Why not? We work well together, we have complementary skills, and there's clearly demand for the kind of work we do. Sarah Beth spread out a map of Colorado territory, marking locations where she knew development projects were underway. Look at all these mining towns, railroad settlements, agricultural communities. They all need buildings restored, improved, made more livable. And most of them face the same kinds of challenges we've learned to solve here. The idea took shape over the following weeks, refined through countless conversations and fueled by their shared excitement about the possibilities. They would establish themselves as specialists in mountain construction and engineering, taking on projects that required both technical expertise and diplomatic skill. We'll need to build a reputation, Thomas pointed out. Convince people that a scarred woman and a reclusive carpenter can handle major construction projects. Then we'll start with smaller projects and let our work speak for itself. Sarah Beth replied with the confidence that had carried her through every challenge. Since arriving in Colorado, people will hire us because we get results, not because we fit their expectations of what contractors should look like. Spring came early that year, melting the snow and opening the mountain passes weeks ahead of schedule. The mining operation resumed with new efficiency, benefiting from the winter's planning and the water management systems that continued to function perfectly. But more importantly for Thomas and Sarah Beth, the early thaw meant They could begin traveling to potential job sites and start building their business. Their first major contract came from an unexpected source, Nathan Hartwell, the territorial land office representative who had originally brought news of the mining consortium's claim. He had heard about their innovative solution to the flooding problem and wanted to hire them to oversee the restoration of a historic fort that was being converted into a territorial administrative center. The previous contractors abandoned the project, Hartwell explained during their meeting in Denver. They couldn't figure out how to preserve the historical integrity while updating the infrastructure for modern use. But based on what I've heard about your work, I think you might be able to find a solution that satisfies everyone. Sarah Beth exchanged a meaningful look with Thomas. The project would be challenging, high-profile, and potentially very lucrative. It would also establish their reputation throughout the territory. "We'll take it," she said without hesitation. "When do we start?" 6 months later, as they stood on the completed battlements of Fort Washburn, watching the sunset paint the eastern plains in shades of gold and amber, Sarah Beth reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. The fort restoration had been a complete success, earning them recognition throughout Colorado territory and contracts for 3 additional projects. But more than professional success, she had found something she had never dared to hope for: a life that was authentically her own, built around her strengths rather than limited by her scars. She had become a respected engineer and project manager, a trusted partner, a woman whose opinions mattered and whose skills were valued. "Any regrets?" Thomas asked, joining her at the stone parapet. Sarah Beth considered the question seriously. "About leaving Boston? About the fire? About the fake marriage proposal that brought me west? About any of it?" She looked out over the vast landscape that had become her home, then at the face of the man who had helped her discover who she truly was beneath the surface damage of her past. "No," she said simply, "no regrets at all. If I hadn't been deceived by that mail-order bride scheme, I never would have come to Colorado. I never would have met you, never would have discovered that I could be an engineer, never would have learned that my scars don't define my worth." Thomas smiled and pulled her close. "So you're saying that the worst thing that ever happened to you led to the best thing that ever happened to you?" "I'm saying that sometimes what looks like an ending is really just a beginning in disguise." Sarah Beth leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid warmth of his presence and the endless possibility of their shared future. That mail-order bride was supposed to meet a man who would tell her she was beautiful despite her scars. Instead, she met a man who helped her realize she was beautiful because of everything she had survived and overcome. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Sarah Beth Blackwood, engineer, partner, survivor, stood beside her husband and looked ahead to whatever challenges and adventures awaited them. The mountains had tested her and found her worthy. The future was theirs to build together, one stone at a time. The girl who had stepped off the stagecoach in Timber Falls with nothing but charity and false hopes had become a woman who created her own opportunities and wrote her own story. And that transformation, more than any conventional notion of beauty or happiness, was the true measure of her success. In the end, love had found her not in spite of her scars, but because of the strength those scars represented. And that was a beautiful thing indeed. The first blizzard of winter arrived 3 weeks earlier than expected, transforming the mountain valley into a crystalline world of pristine beauty and practical challenges. Sarah Beth woke to absolute silence, the kind of profound quiet that only comes when snow has muffled every sound and the world has been temporarily suspended beneath a blanket of white. From her cabin window, she could see that the storm had deposited nearly 2 feet of snow overnight, effectively isolating the valley from the outside world until the spring thaw. The mining operation had ceased completely, with Brennan and his crew settling into the winter quarters they had constructed near their equipment. The enforced hibernation would give everyone time to rest, plan, and reflect on the extraordinary events of the past few months. Thomas appeared at her door shortly after sunrise, his dark hair dusted with snowflakes and his green eyes bright with excitement rather than concern. "Well," he said with a grin that reminded her of a schoolboy on an unexpected holiday, "it looks like we're officially snowed in until spring. I hope you're prepared for several months of very close quarters with your business partner." The easy reference to their partnership warmed Sarah Beth more than the coffee she was brewing. Over the months of working together, their relationship had evolved into something that defied simple categorization. They were business partners, certainly, but also friends, confidants, and something more that neither of them had yet found the courage to name explicitly. "I think I can manage," she replied with mock solemnity. "Though you should know that I've been planning some improvements to the main house that will require your carpentry expertise." "Improvements?" Sarah Beth led him to the kitchen table where she had spread out hand-drawn plans that represented weeks of careful observation and planning. "The water management system we built for the mining operation gave me ideas about how we could improve the domestic systems as well. Better drainage, more efficient heating, expanded storage space." Thomas studied her sketches with growing admiration. The plans were detailed and practical, showing a sophisticated understanding of both engineering principles and the specific challenges of mountain living. "Sarah Beth, these are remarkable. Where did you learn to design systems like this?" "From watching you work mostly. And from necessity, I've been thinking about how to make this place more livable. She paused, suddenly uncertain about how to finish the sentence. "For the long term?" Thomas supplied gently. She nodded, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. The assumption of a shared future had been implicit in many of their recent conversations, but neither of them had addressed it directly. The enforced isolation of winter seemed to demand more honesty about their intentions and expectations. "Thomas," she said carefully, "we should probably discuss what we're planning for the spring. Whether you'll be staying here, whether there will still be work for me, whether we're going to continue pretending that we're just business partners." Thomas interrupted, his voice carrying a warmth that made her heart race. Sarah Beth looked up from her sketches to find him watching her with an expression of such tenderness that it took her breath away. The careful distance they had maintained, even through all their collaboration and shared challenges, suddenly seemed artificial and unnecessary. "Sarah Beth," Thomas continued, moving closer to her chair, "I need you to know that what we've built here goes far beyond any professional arrangement. You've become essential to my life in ways I never expected." The words hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Sarah Beth felt 3 years of accumulated defenses beginning to crumble, replaced by a hope so fragile and precious that she was almost afraid to acknowledge it. "I feel the same way," she whispered. "But Thomas, I need you to understand what you're considering. I'm not the woman I was before the fire. I may never be able to give you the kind of life that—" "Stop." Thomas reached out to touch her scarred cheek with infinite gentleness. "Sarah Beth, look at me." She raised her eyes to meet his, seeing nothing but love and acceptance in their green depths. "The woman you were before the fire is not the woman I fell in love with," he said simply. "I fell in love with the woman who stood up to Cyrus Brennan, who engineered a solution to save a mining operation, who turned a business negotiation into a partnership that benefits everyone involved. I fell in love with your courage, your intelligence, your determination to build something meaningful despite everything you've endured." The words washed over her like warm rain after a long drought. For the first time since the mill fire, someone was telling her that her scars didn't diminish her value, that they were simply part of the story of who she had become. "Thomas," she began, but he wasn't finished. "I know you think your appearance makes you somehow less worthy of love, but Sarah Beth, when I look at you, I see the most beautiful woman I've ever known. Beautiful because of your strength, because of your kindness, because of the way you face every challenge with grace and determination." Tears were streaming down her face now, tears of relief, of joy, of a kind of healing she hadn't dared to hope for. The careful shell she had built around her heart was cracking open, letting in light she had thought was lost forever. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have for weeks, but I was so afraid ... Afraid of what? Afraid that if I let myself hope for us, it would be taken away again. Afraid that I was being foolish to think that someone could love me as I am now." Thomas pulled her into his arms, holding her close while she cried out years of accumulated pain and self-doubt. When her tears finally subsided, he tilted her chin up so she could see his face. "Sarah Beth Williams," he said solemnly, "will you marry me? Not because you need protection or because I need a housekeeper, but because I want to spend the rest of my life building something extraordinary with the most remarkable woman I've ever known." The proposal was so perfectly suited to who they had become together that Sarah Beth laughed through her lingering tears. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, Thomas Blackwood, I will marry you. And I want to build something extraordinary too." They were married 3 days later in a ceremony that was as unconventional as their courtship had been. With the valley snowed in and no minister available, they exchanged vows in front of the stone fireplace of the main house, with Cyrus Brennan serving as witness and Murphy offering a blessing in the Irish tradition of his childhood. Sarah Beth wore her best dress, a simple blue wool that brought out the color of her eyes, with her hair arranged in a style that didn't hide her scars, but didn't emphasize them either. She had stopped trying to make herself invisible, accepting Thomas's assertion that her worth had nothing to do with conventional notions of beauty. "Do you, Thomas Blackwood, take Sarah Beth Williams to be your wife, your partner, and your equal in all things?" Brennan asked, reading from a book of legal ceremonies he had found among the mining company's supplies. "I do," Thomas replied, his voice carrying across the room with complete certainty. "And do you, Sarah Beth Williams, take Thomas Blackwood to be your husband, your partner, and your equal in all things?" "I do," Sarah Beth said, feeling the words resonate through her entire being. They had no rings to exchange, but Thomas had carved 2 wooden bands from mountain oak, simple and strong like their love. As they slipped them onto each other's fingers, Sarah Beth felt a completeness she had never experienced before, not just the joy of being loved, but the deeper satisfaction of being truly known and accepted. The wedding celebration was modest but joyful, with Murphy contributing a bottle of Irish whiskey he had been saving for a special occasion, and several of the miners offering toasts that ranged from sentimental to hilariously inappropriate. Even Brennan, who had initially seemed incapable of viewing their relationship as anything but a business inconvenience, raised his glass with genuine warmth. "To Thomas and Sarah Beth," he said formally, "who taught us all that the most valuable partnerships are built on mutual respect and shared purpose." As winter deepened around their valley sanctuary, the newlyweds settled into a domestic rhythm that felt both natural and miraculous. They spent their days working on the house improvements Sarah Beth had designed, turning the Henderson place into a true home that reflected their combined vision for the future. The evenings were spent by the fire, planning not just for the coming spring, but for the years beyond. Thomas had received word through the mining company's communications that his former employer wanted to hire him for another restoration project. But now their response would be different. "We could take on projects together," Sarah Beth suggested one snowy evening as they reviewed the offer. "You handle the construction and carpentry, I handle the project management and client relations. We could build a reputation as a team that specializes in challenging restoration work." Thomas looked up from the letter with eyes full of admiration. "You want to turn this into a business partnership as well as a marriage? Why not? We work well together, we have complementary skills, and there's clearly demand for the kind of work we do." Sarah Beth spread out a map of Colorado territory, marking locations where she knew development projects were underway. Look at all these mining towns, railroad settlements, agricultural communities. They all need buildings restored, improved, made more livable. And most of them face the same kinds of challenges we've learned to solve here. The idea took shape over the following weeks, refined through countless conversations and fueled by their shared excitement about the possibilities. They would establish themselves as specialists in mountain construction and engineering, taking on projects that required both technical expertise and diplomatic skill. We'll need to build a reputation, Thomas pointed out. Convince people that a scarred woman and a reclusive carpenter can handle major construction projects. Then we'll start with smaller projects and let our work speak for itself, Sarah Beth replied with the confidence that had carried her through every challenge. Since arriving in Colorado, people will hire us because we get results, not because we fit their expectations of what contractors should look like. Spring came early that year, melting the snow and opening the mountain passes weeks ahead of schedule. The mining operation resumed with new efficiency, benefiting from the winter's planning and the water management systems that continued to function perfectly. But more importantly for Thomas and Sarah Beth, the early thaw meant they could begin traveling to potential job sites and start building their business. Their first major contract came from an unexpected source, Nathan Hartwell, the territorial land office representative who had originally brought news of the mining consortium's claim. He had heard about their innovative solution to the flooding problem and wanted to hire them to oversee the restoration of a historic fort that was being converted into a territorial administrative center. The previous contractors abandoned the project, Hartwell explained during their meeting in Denver. They couldn't figure out how to preserve the historical integrity while updating the infrastructure for modern use. But based on what I've heard about your work, I think you might be able to find a solution that satisfies everyone. Sarah Beth exchanged a meaningful look with Thomas. The project would be challenging, high-profile, and potentially very lucrative. It would also establish their reputation throughout the territory. We'll take it, she said without hesitation. When do we start? 6 months later, as they stood on the completed battlements of Fort Washburn, watching the sunset paint the eastern plains in shades of gold and amber, Sarah Beth reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. The fort restoration had been a complete success, earning them recognition throughout Colorado territory and contracts for 3 additional projects. But more than professional success, she had found something she had never dared to hope for: a life that was authentically her own, built around her strengths rather than limited by her scars. She had become a respected engineer and project manager, a trusted partner, a woman whose opinions mattered and whose skills were valued. Any regrets? Thomas asked, joining her at the stone parapet. Sarah Beth considered the question seriously. About leaving Boston? About the fire? About the fake marriage proposal that brought me west? About any of it. She looked out over the vast landscape that had become her home, then at the face of the man who had helped her discover who she truly was beneath the surface damage of her past. No, she said simply. No regrets at all. If I hadn't been deceived by that mail-order bride scheme, I never would have come to Colorado. I never would have met you, never would have discovered that I could be an engineer, never would have learned that my scars don't define my worth. Thomas smiled and pulled her close. So you're saying that the worst thing that ever happened to you led to the best thing that ever happened to you? I'm saying that sometimes what looks like an ending is really just a beginning in disguise. Sarah Beth leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid warmth of his presence and the endless possibility of their shared future. That mail-order bride was supposed to meet a man who would tell her she was beautiful despite her scars. Instead, she met a man who helped her realize she was beautiful because of everything she had survived and overcome. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Sarah Beth Blackwood, engineer, partner, Survivor stood beside her husband and looked ahead to whatever challenges and adventures awaited them. The mountains had tested her and found her worthy. The future was theirs to build together, one stone at a time. The girl who had stepped off the stagecoach in Timber Falls, with nothing but charity and false hopes, had become a woman who created her own opportunities and wrote her own story. And that transformation, more than any conventional notion of beauty or happiness, was the true measure of her success. In the end, love had found her not in spite of her scars, but because of the strength those scars represented. And that was a beautiful thing indeed. The first blizzard of winter arrived 3 weeks earlier than expected, transforming the mountain valley into a crystalline world of pristine beauty and practical challenges. Sarah Beth woke to absolute silence, the kind of profound quiet that only comes when snow has muffled every sound and the world has been temporarily suspended beneath a blanket of white. From her cabin window, she could see that the storm had deposited nearly 2 feet of snow overnight, effectively isolating the valley from the outside world until the spring thaw. The mining operation had ceased completely, with Brennan and his crew settling into the winter quarters they had constructed near their equipment. The enforced hibernation would give everyone time to rest, plan, and reflect on the extraordinary events of the past few months. Thomas appeared at her door shortly after sunrise, his dark hair dusted with snowflakes and his green eyes bright with excitement rather than concern. "Well," he said with a grin that reminded her of a schoolboy on an unexpected holiday, "it looks like we're officially snowed in until spring. I hope you're prepared for several months of very close quarters with your business partner." The easy reference to their partnership warmed Sarah Beth more than the coffee she was brewing. Over the months of working together, their relationship had evolved into something that defied simple categorization. They were business partners, certainly, but also friends, confidants, and something more that neither of them had yet found: the courage to name explicitly. "I think I can manage," she replied with mock solemnity. "Though you should know that I've been planning some improvements to the main house that will require your carpentry expertise." "Improvements?" Sarah Beth led him to the kitchen table where she had spread out hand-drawn plans that represented weeks of careful observation and planning. "The water management system we built for the mining operation gave me ideas about how we could improve the domestic systems as well. Better drainage, more efficient heating, expanded storage space." Thomas studied her sketches with growing admiration. The plans were detailed and practical, showing a sophisticated understanding of both engineering principles and the specific challenges of mountain living. "Sarah Beth, these are remarkable. Where did you learn to design systems like this?" "From watching you work, mostly. And from necessity, I've been thinking about how to make this place more livable. She paused, suddenly uncertain about how to finish the sentence. "For the long term?" Thomas supplied gently. She nodded, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. The assumption of a shared future had been implicit in many of their recent conversations, but neither of them had addressed it directly. The enforced isolation of winter seemed to demand more honesty about their intentions and expectations. "Thomas," she said carefully, "we should probably discuss what we're planning for the spring. Whether you'll be staying here, whether there will still be work for me, whether we're going to continue pretending that we're just business partners." Thomas interrupted, his voice carrying a warmth that made her heart race. Sarah Beth looked up from her sketches to find him watching her with an expression of such tenderness that it took her breath away. The careful distance they had maintained, even through all their collaboration and shared challenges, suddenly seemed artificial and unnecessary. "Sarah Beth," Thomas continued, moving closer to her chair, "I need you to know that what we've built here goes far beyond any professional arrangement. You've become essential to my life in ways I never expected." The words hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Sarah Beth felt 3 years of accumulated defenses beginning to crumble, replaced by a hope so fragile and precious that she was almost afraid to acknowledge it. "I feel the same way," she whispered. "But Thomas, I need you to understand what you're considering. I'm not the woman I was before the fire. I may never be able to give you the kind of life that—" "Stop." Thomas reached out to touch her scarred cheek with infinite gentleness. "Sarah Beth, look at me." She raised her eyes to meet his, seeing nothing but love and acceptance in their green depths. "The woman you were before the fire is not the woman I fell in love with," he said simply. "I fell in love with the woman who stood up to Cyrus Brennan, who engineered a solution to save a mining operation, who turned a business negotiation into a partnership that benefits everyone involved. I fell in love with your courage, your intelligence, your determination to build something meaningful, despite everything you've endured." The words washed over her like warm rain after a long drought. For the first time since the mill fire, someone was telling her that her scars didn't diminish her value, that they were simply part of the story of who she had become. "Thomas," she began, but he wasn't finished. "I know you think your appearance makes you somehow less worthy of love. But Sarah Beth, when I look at you, I see the most beautiful woman I've ever known. Beautiful because of your strength, because of your kindness, because of the way you face every challenge with grace and determination." Tears were streaming down her face, now tears of relief, of joy, of a kind of healing she hadn't dared to hope for. The careful shell she had built around her heart was cracking open, letting in light she had thought was lost forever. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have for weeks, but I was so afraid ... Afraid of what? Afraid that if I let myself hope for this, for us, it would be taken away again. Afraid that I was being foolish to think that someone could love me as I am now." Thomas pulled her into his arms, holding her close while she cried out years of accumulated pain and self-doubt. When her tears finally subsided, he tilted her chin up so she could see his face. "Sarah Beth Williams," he said solemnly, "will you marry me? Not because you need protection or because I need a housekeeper, but because I want to spend the rest of my life building something extraordinary with the most remarkable woman I've ever known." The proposal was so perfectly suited to who they had become together that Sarah Beth laughed through her lingering tears. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, Thomas Blackwood, I will marry you. And I want to build something extraordinary too." They were married 3 days later in a ceremony that was as unconventional as their courtship had been. With the valley snowed in and no minister available, they exchanged vows in front of the stone fireplace of the main house, with Cyrus Brennan serving as witness and Murphy offering a blessing in the Irish tradition of his childhood. Sarah Beth wore her best dress, a simple blue wool that brought out the color of her eyes, with her hair arranged in a style that didn't hide her scars, but didn't emphasize them either. She had stopped trying to make herself invisible, accepting Thomas's assertion that her worth had nothing to do with conventional notions of beauty. "Do you, Thomas Blackwood, take Sarah Beth Williams to be your wife, your partner, and your equal in all things?" Brennan asked, reading from a book of legal ceremonies he had found among the mining company's supplies. "I do," Thomas replied, his voice carrying across the room with complete certainty. "And do you, Sarah Beth Williams, take Thomas Blackwood to be your husband, your partner, and your equal in all things?" "I do," Sarah Beth said, feeling the words resonate through her entire being. They had no rings to exchange, but Thomas had carved 2 wooden bands from mountain oak, simple and strong like their love. As they slipped them onto each other's fingers, Sarah Beth felt a completeness she had never experienced before. Not just the joy of being loved, but the deeper satisfaction of being truly known and accepted. The wedding celebration was modest but joyful, with Murphy contributing a bottle of Irish whiskey he had been saving for a special occasion, and several of the miners offering toasts that ranged from sentimental to hilariously inappropriate. Even Brennan, who had initially seemed incapable of viewing their relationship as anything but a business inconvenience, raised his glass with genuine warmth. "To Thomas and Sarah Beth," he said formally, "who taught us all that the most valuable partnerships are built on mutual respect and shared purpose." As winter deepened around their valley sanctuary, the newlyweds settled into a domestic rhythm that felt both natural and miraculous. They spent their days working on the house improvements Sarah Beth had designed, turning the Henderson place into a true home that reflected their combined vision for the future. The evenings were spent by the fire, planning not just for the coming spring, but for the years beyond. Thomas had received word through the mining company's communications that his former employer wanted to hire him for another restoration project, but now their response would be different. "We could take on projects together," Sarah Beth suggested one snowy evening as they reviewed the offer. "You handle the construction and carpentry. I handle the project management and client relations. We could build a reputation as a team that specializes in challenging restoration work." Thomas looked up from the letter with eyes full of admiration. "You want to turn this into a business partnership as well as a marriage? Why not? We work well together, we have complementary skills, and there's clearly demand for the kind of work we do." Sarah Beth spread out a map of Colorado territory, marking locations where she knew development projects were underway. "Look at all these mining towns, railroad settlements, agricultural communities. They all need buildings restored, improved, made more livable, and most of them face the same kinds of challenges we've learned to solve here." The idea took shape over the following weeks, refined through countless conversations and fueled by their shared excitement about the possibilities. They would establish themselves as specialists in mountain construction and engineering, taking on projects that required both technical expertise and diplomatic skill. "We'll need to build a reputation," Thomas pointed out. "Convince people that a scarred woman and a reclusive carpenter can handle major construction projects. Then we'll start with smaller projects and let our work speak for itself." Sarah Beth replied with the confidence that had carried her through every challenge. "Since arriving in Colorado, people will hire us because we get results, not because we fit their expectations of what contractors should look like." Spring came early that year, melting the snow and opening the mountain passes weeks ahead of schedule. The mining operation resumed with new efficiency, benefiting from the winter's planning and the water management systems that continued to function perfectly. But more importantly for Thomas and Sarah Beth, the early thaw meant they could begin traveling to potential job sites and start building their business. Their first major contract came from an unexpected source, Nathan Hartwell, the territorial land office representative who had originally brought news of the mining consortium's claim. He had heard about their innovative solution to the flooding problem and wanted to hire them to oversee the restoration of a historic fort that was being converted into a territorial administrative center. The previous contractors abandoned the project, Hartwell explained during their meeting in Denver. They couldn't figure out how to preserve the historical integrity while updating the infrastructure for modern use. "But based on what I've heard about your work, I think you might be able to find a solution that satisfies everyone." Sarah Beth exchanged a meaningful look with Thomas. The project would be challenging, high-profile, and potentially very lucrative. It would also establish their reputation throughout the territory. "We'll take it," she said, without hesitation. "When do we start?" 6 months later, as they stood on the completed battlements of Fort Washburn, watching the sunset paint the eastern plains in shades of gold and amber, Sarah Beth reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. The fort restoration had been a complete success, earning them recognition throughout Colorado territory and contracts for 3 additional projects. But more than professional success, she had found something she had never dared to hope for: a life that was authentically her own, built around her strengths rather than limited by her scars. She had become a respected engineer and project manager, a trusted partner, a woman whose opinions mattered and whose skills were valued. Any regrets? Thomas asked, joining her at the stone parapet. Sarah Beth considered the question seriously. About leaving Boston? About the fire? About the fake marriage proposal that brought me west? About any of it. She looked out over the vast landscape that had become her home, then at the face of the man who had helped her discover who she truly was beneath the surface damage of her past. No, she said simply, no regrets at all. If I hadn't been deceived by that mail-order bride scheme, I never would have come to Colorado. I never would have met you, never would have discovered that I could be an engineer, never would have learned that my scars don't define my worth. Thomas smiled and pulled her close. So you're saying that the worst thing that ever happened to you led to the best thing that ever happened to you? I'm saying that sometimes what looks like an ending is really just a beginning in disguise. Sarah Beth leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid warmth of his presence and the endless possibility of their shared future. That mail-order bride was supposed to meet a man who would tell her she was beautiful despite her scars. Instead, she met a man who helped her realize she was beautiful because of everything she had survived and overcome. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Sarah Beth Blackwood, engineer, partner, survivor, stood beside her husband and looked ahead to whatever challenges and adventures awaited them. The mountains had tested her and found her worthy. The future was theirs to build together, one stone at a time. The girl who had stepped off the stagecoach in Timber Falls with nothing but charity and false hopes had become a woman who created her own opportunities and wrote her own story. And that transformation, more than any conventional notion of beauty or happiness, was the true measure of her success. In the end, love had found her not in spite of her scars, but because of the strength those scars represented. And that was a beautiful thing indeed. The success of the Fort Washburn project opened doors that Sarah Beth had never imagined possible. Word of their innovative restoration techniques spread throughout the territory, bringing inquiries from as far away as California and Texas. Railroad companies wanted them to restore historic stations. Mining corporations sought their expertise for converting abandoned facilities, and territorial governments commissioned them to preserve buildings of historical significance. Each project brought new challenges and opportunities for growth. In the ghost town of Silver Creek, they transformed an abandoned opera house into a community center that became the heart of a revitalized settlement. In the railroad town of Junction City, they converted a defunct grain elevator into affordable housing for workers and their families. Every success built upon the last, creating a reputation that transcended the initial skepticism about a scarred woman and a reclusive carpenter. But perhaps their most meaningful project came in their second year of marriage when they received an unexpected letter from Boston. Sarah Beth's mother, Elizabeth Williams, had finally gathered the courage to reach out to her daughter after years of painful silence. "My dearest Sarah Beth," the letter began, "I have heard from Mrs. Patterson in Colorado about your marriage and your business success. I write to you now with a heart full of regret for the silence I have maintained since you left Boston. I was so consumed by grief for what you had lost that I failed to see what you were becoming. I would very much like to meet the woman you have grown to be, if you would allow me the privilege of visiting your new home." The letter stirred emotions that Sarah Beth thought she had resolved. The pain of her family's inability to accept her changed appearance had been one of the driving forces behind her decision to seek a new life in the West. Yet now, with years of distance and growth behind her, she found herself curious about the possibility of reconciliation. "What do you think?" she asked Thomas, passing him the letter as they sat in their newly completed home office, surrounded by architectural plans and project proposals. Thomas read the letter carefully, his expression thoughtful. "I think," he said finally, "that people can change and grow just as much as you have. The question is whether you want to give your mother the chance to prove it." After much consideration, Sarah Beth wrote back, extending an invitation for her mother to visit during the summer months. The reunion, when it came, was both healing and transformative for both women. Elizabeth Williams stepped off the stagecoach in Timber Falls, a changed woman, herself widowed now, and worn by years of regret. But when she saw her daughter waiting on the platform, confident and radiant despite her scars, her face crumpled with a mixture of joy and remorse. "My darling girl," she whispered as they embraced. "I was so afraid you would never forgive me for failing you when you needed me most." "There's nothing to forgive, Mother," Sarah Beth replied, and meant it completely. "We were all doing the best we could with circumstances none of us understood." The 3 weeks of Elizabeth's visit passed in a whirlwind of activity. Sarah Beth showed her mother every aspect of their life, the house she and Thomas had built together, the business they had created, the community they had become part of. Elizabeth watched her daughter negotiate with contractors, solve engineering problems, and command respect from men who initially doubted her expertise. "You've become extraordinary," Elizabeth told her daughter one evening as they sat on the porch watching Thomas work with a crew of local men to install new water lines for the town. "Not despite what happened to you, but because of how you chose to respond to it." "I had good teachers," Sarah Beth replied, thinking of Mrs. Patterson's kindness, Thomas's unwavering support, and even Cyrus Brennan's eventual respect. "And I learned that sometimes the worst things that happen to us force us to discover strengths we never knew we had." Elizabeth's visit culminated in an unexpected proposal. She had been considering what to do with the family property in Boston, and Sarah Beth's success had given her an idea. "What would you think," she asked tentatively, "about establishing an office in Boston? A branch of your business that could handle restoration projects throughout New England?" The suggestion was intriguing from both professional and personal perspectives. There was certainly demand for their specialized skills in the rapidly industrializing Northeast, and having a presence in Boston would give them access to a much larger market. But more than that, it would represent a kind of full-circle journey for Sarah Beth, returning to her origins not as the broken woman who had fled west, but as a successful businesswoman with skills and a reputation that commanded respect. It would mean spending several months a year in Boston, Sarah Beth mused. "Are you prepared for that kind of disruption to our mountain life?" Thomas considered the question seriously. "I think," he said slowly, "that we've learned to adapt to whatever challenges come our way. And besides, it might be good for us to have a broader impact, to help more communities preserve their history while building for the future." The decision to expand their business proved to be another turning point in their remarkable journey. Within a year, Blackwood Restoration had offices in both Denver and Boston, with a reputation that extended throughout the Western Territories and into the established Eastern states. Sarah Beth found herself traveling regularly between the two worlds she had inhabited, the refined society of Boston, where she was now welcomed as a successful businesswoman rather than pitied as a victim, and the rugged freedom of Colorado, where she had first discovered her true capabilities. The contrast was illuminating. In Boston drawing rooms where she had once felt like a pariah, she now found herself sought after for her expertise and her unique perspective on adaptation and resilience. Society ladies who had once whispered about her disfigurement now competed to hire her services for their own restoration projects. "It's remarkable," she wrote to Mrs. Patterson during one of her Boston visits, "how much people's attitudes change when you stop seeing yourself as damaged and start seeing yourself as experienced." But it was during a project in Salem, Massachusetts, restoring a textile mill that had been damaged in a fire remarkably similar to the one that had changed her life, that Sarah Beth experienced perhaps her most profound moment of transformation. Standing in the burned-out shell of the mill, surrounded by the same kind of industrial debris that had once nearly killed her, she felt not the old terror and helplessness, but a sense of purposeful determination. This building could be saved, just as she had been saved. It could be transformed into something better than it had been before, just as she had been transformed. The key, she explained to the mill owner as they walked through the damaged space, is not to try to hide the evidence of what happened here, but to incorporate it into something stronger and more beautiful. She pointed to the fire-darkened brick walls, the twisted metal beams, the spaces where windows had been blown out by the heat. We can preserve these elements as part of the building's history while adding modern safety features and improved working conditions. The result will be a structure that honors its past while serving the future. The mill restoration became one of their most celebrated projects, featured in newspapers throughout New England as an example of innovative preservation techniques. But for Sarah Beth, it represented something even more significant: the complete integration of her past trauma into her current strength. Years passed, and their business continued to flourish. They restored mission churches in California, railroad depots in Wyoming, historic courthouses in Texas. Each project added to their expertise and their reputation, but also to their understanding of how buildings, like people, could be transformed. By thoughtful care and creative vision, their personal life flourished as well. The mountain home they had built together became a gathering place for friends and colleagues from across the continent. Cyrus Brennan, now a close friend and frequent collaborator, brought his wife and children for summer visits. Mrs. Patterson, aging but still spirited, made the journey from Timber Falls for every major celebration. But perhaps the most meaningful development came in their 5th year of marriage, when Sarah Beth discovered she was expecting their first child. The pregnancy was a source of wonder and some anxiety. She worried about how her scars might affect her ability to care for an infant, whether her damaged appearance might somehow harm her child's social prospects. Thomas, as always, provided the reassurance and perspective she needed. "Our child," he told her as they sat together watching the sunset from their favorite spot on the porch, "will grow up knowing that strength comes in many forms, that beauty has nothing to do with perfection, and that the most important thing about any person is what they choose to do with their gifts." Their daughter, Anna Elizabeth Blackwood, named for Thomas's first wife and Sarah, Beth's mother, was born on a crisp October morning with the aspens turning gold around their mountain home. She entered the world healthy and strong, with her father's green eyes and her mother's determined chin dot, as Sarah Beth held her daughter for the first time. Feeling the baby's tiny fingers wrapped around her scarred hand, she experienced a moment of perfect clarity about the journey that had brought her to this point. The mail-order bride deception that had seemed like the end of all her hopes had actually been the beginning of a life beyond anything she had imagined possible. The scars that had once made her feel unworthy of love had become symbols of her strength and resilience. The isolation that had driven her to the mountains had led her to discover capabilities she never knew she possessed. "Look at you, little one," she whispered to her daughter. "You're going to grow up in a world where your mother is an engineer and businesswoman, where your father sees strength and beauty in all kinds of faces, where people are valued for what they contribute rather than how they look." Thomas leaned over to kiss both his wife and daughter, his face radiant with love and pride. "She's going to be extraordinary," he said simply. "She already is," Sarah Beth replied, thinking not just of the miracle of new life, but of the miracle of the life they had built together, a life that proved every day that the most beautiful stories often begin with the most devastating chapters. As baby Anna slept peacefully in her arms, Sarah Beth looked out at the mountains that had become her sanctuary and her strength. Somewhere out there, she knew, other women were facing their own devastating chapters, their own moments of despair and loss. But perhaps, if her story could reach them, they would understand that endings and beginnings were often the same thing, and that the most profound transformations came not from avoiding scars, but from learning to wear them with pride. The mountain man who had said, "You're beautiful as you are," had given her more than love. He had given her the gift of seeing herself through eyes unclouded by society's narrow definitions of worth. And that gift, she was determined, would be her daughter's birthright and her lasting legacy to the world. 20-5 years after Sarah Beth Williams first stepped off that dusty stagecoach in Timber Falls, she stood before the Colorado Territorial Legislature as the first woman ever invited to address the Assembly on matters of industrial safety and workers' rights. The chamber, filled with powerful men who shaped the future of the growing territory, fell silent as she approached the podium with the confident stride of someone who had earned her place. Through decades of proven expertise, the scars that had once made her hide in shadows were still visible, silver white against her weathered skin, but they no longer defined her appearance. Instead, they were simply part of the story written on the face of a woman who had become one of the most respected engineers and social reformers in the American West. "Honorable legislators," she began, her voice carrying easily through the vaulted chamber, "I stand before you today not as a victim of an industrial accident, but as someone who has dedicated her life to ensuring that such tragedies become increasingly rare." The speech she delivered that day would later be credited with launching the territorial safety reform movement. But for Sarah Beth, it represented something even more significant: the complete transformation of her relationship with her own past. The mill fire that had once seemed like the end of everything had become the foundation of a life's work dedicated to protecting others from similar fates. Her presentation focused on the comprehensive safety protocols she and Thomas had developed. Through their restoration work, innovations that had been adopted by mining operations, textile mills, and construction projects throughout the West. But it also addressed the human cost of industrial accidents, the families shattered, the workers disabled, the communities devastated by preventable tragedies. "Every safety measure we implement," she told the assembled legislators, "represents not just a reduction in economic loss, but a preservation of human potential. We cannot calculate the value of a life lived fully, a family kept whole, a community allowed to thrive." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within months, the territorial legislature had passed the most comprehensive industrial safety regulations in the nation, with Sarah Beth appointed as the first director of industrial safety, a position created specifically to honor her expertise and ensure the effective implementation of the new laws. The appointment required her to relocate to Denver permanently, leaving behind the mountain home where she had first discovered her strength. But as she and Thomas packed their belongings, preparing for this new chapter, Sarah Beth felt no sadness at the change. Their mountain sanctuary had served its purpose, transforming her from a broken refugee into a confident leader. Now it was time to carry that transformation into the wider world. Their daughter Anna, now 20 years old and a graduate of the Colorado School of Engineering, one of the first women to earn such a degree, had already surpassed her parents' achievements. In many ways, she had designed innovative bridge construction techniques that were being used throughout the railroad expansion, and her work on earthquake-resistant building methods had attracted attention from as far away as California and Japan. "It's remarkable," Thomas observed as they watched Anna present her latest research to a gathering of territorial engineers, "how naturally she assumes that her gender is irrelevant to her professional capabilities." Sarah Beth smiled, remembering her own struggles to be taken seriously in male-dominated industries. "That's exactly what we hoped for when we decided to raise her here. She's never known a world where women were automatically considered less capable." But Anna's confidence and success represented more than just good parenting. They reflected a broader change in society that Sarah Beth and Thomas had helped to foster. Through their work, their visibility, and their refusal to accept conventional limitations, they had created ripples that extended far beyond their own lives. The Blackwood Restoration Company had become a model for women's participation in technical fields. Sarah Beth's insistence on hiring and training female engineers and architects had created a network of professional women who were now transforming industries throughout the region. Many of these women had their own stories of overcoming adversity, Some had physical disabilities. Others came from impoverished backgrounds. Still others had faced discrimination based on their ethnicity or social class. "What we've created," Sarah Beth told a gathering of these women at the first annual conference of Western professional women, "is proof that competence and character matter more than conformity to conventional expectations. Each of you represents a door open not just for yourself, but for every woman who will follow." The conference had been Anna's idea, but Sarah Beth's support had made it possible. Women from across the territorial regions gathered in Denver to share their experiences, discuss challenges, and celebrate achievements that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Engineers and architects, doctors and lawyers, business owners and politicians, all united by their determination to expand the definition of what was possible for their gender. Among the attendees was Margaret Chen, a Chinese-American woman who had designed the irrigation systems that transformed the San Luis Valley into productive farmland. There was Rosa Martinez, whose innovations in mining safety had reduced accident rates by more than half in the silver mines of Leadville. Dr. Catherine Morrison had established the territory's first hospital specifically designed and staffed by women, providing care that was both medically advanced and emotionally supportive. Each woman's story was unique, but they shared common themes of perseverance, innovation, and the refusal to accept limitations imposed by others. Sarah Beth saw in each of them a reflection of her own journey, the transformation from victim to victor, from hidden to celebrated, from broken to beautifully strong. But perhaps the most meaningful development of these later years was the establishment of the Sarah Beth Blackwood Foundation for Industrial Safety and Workers' Rights. Funded by the profits from their restoration business and supported by donations from grateful clients and communities, the foundation provided compensation for workers injured in industrial accidents, training for safety inspectors, and research into accident prevention techniques. The foundation's work extended far beyond financial support. It advocated for legislative changes, educated workers about their rights, and provided legal assistance to families seeking compensation for workplace injuries. Most importantly, it carried forward Sarah Beth's conviction that no one should be discarded or forgotten simply because they had been damaged by circumstances beyond their control. "Every person who has been hurt, scarred, or broken by an industrial accident deserves the same chance I had," Sarah Beth explained to the foundation's board of directors. "The chance to discover that their worth is not determined by their appearance or their limitations, but by their contributions and their character." The foundation's most ambitious project was the construction of a rehabilitation center in Colorado Springs, designed specifically for workers recovering from industrial injuries. The facility combined medical treatment with vocational retraining, counseling services with practical job placement assistance. It was, in essence, an institutionalized version of the personal transformation that Sarah Beth had experienced in the mountains. Thomas, now in his 60s but still robust and energetic, served as the center's chief architect and construction supervisor. His design incorporated everything they had learned about creating spaces that fostered healing and hope, natural light, mountain views, barrier-free access, and work areas where patients could begin rebuilding their confidence through meaningful activity. "This is what we've been building toward all along," he told Sarah Beth as they walked through the completed facility on opening day. "A place where people can discover that an ending can also be a beginning." The opening ceremony was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by Sarah Beth's work. Former clients, fellow professionals, government officials, and industrial workers gathered to celebrate not just the completion of a building, but the realization of a vision that had been decades in the making. But the most moving moment came when a young woman approached Sarah Beth after the formal speeches had ended. She was perhaps 25 years old, with burn scars covering one side of her face and neck, clearly a survivor of an industrial accident, similar to the one that had changed Sarah Beth's life. Mrs. Blackwood, the young woman said, her voice trembling with emotion. My name is Helen Foster. I was injured in a factory fire in Pueblo last year. When I was recovering, the doctors gave me a book about your life, about how you overcame your injuries to become successful. It saved my life. Sarah Beth felt her own eyes fill with tears as she looked at this young woman who represented both her past and her future legacy. Tell me about yourself, Helen. What are your dreams? I want to be an engineer like your daughter, Helen replied with growing confidence. I want to design factories that are safe for workers that can't burn down and hurt people the way I was hurt. The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour, with Sarah Beth providing both practical advice about engineering education and emotional support about overcoming society's prejudices against disfigurement. By the end of their talk, she had arranged for Helen to receive a foundation scholarship to attend the Colorado School of Engineering. 25 years ago, Sarah Beth confided to Thomas that evening as they sat in their Denver home, I thought my life was over because of my scars. Today, I met a young woman whose life is just beginning because she knows that scars don't have to be limitations. The full-circle nature of the encounter highlighted something that had become increasingly clear to Sarah Beth over the years. Her story had never really been about her alone. It was about the universal human capacity for transformation, about the possibility of finding strength in the very experiences that seem most likely to destroy us. As she approached her 70th birthday, Sarah Beth found herself increasingly focused on preserving and sharing the lessons she had learned. She began writing her memoirs, not as a tale of personal triumph, but as a guide for others facing their own moments of devastating change. The secret, she wrote in one particularly reflective passage, is not to try to return to who you were before the trauma, but to discover who you can become because of it. Our scars, whether visible or hidden, are not evidence of our weakness, but proof of our strength. The book, published by a Denver press and distributed throughout the territorial regions, became a bestseller that was read by people facing all kinds of adversity. Factory workers recovering from accidents, women seeking to enter male-dominated professions, immigrants adapting to a new culture, anyone struggling to rebuild their lives after loss or failure, all found inspiration in Sarah Beth's story of transformation. But perhaps the most gratifying response came from an unexpected source, a letter from Boston written by the daughters of her former social circle, women who had watched her exile and disgrace, but had now become advocates for social reform in their own right. Dear Mrs. Blackwood, the letter began, we write to you as representatives of the Boston Women's Progressive Alliance, an organization dedicated to advancing opportunities for women in professional and public life. Your example has shown us that true leadership comes not from avoiding difficulties, but from transforming them into opportunities to serve others. The letter went on to describe the changes that had taken place in Boston society over the decades since Sarah Beth's departure. Women were increasingly active in business and professional life. Industrial safety had become a major social concern, and the rigid social conventions that had once dictated a woman's worth based on her appearance and marital status had begun to give way to more enlightened attitudes. We want you to know, the letter concluded, that your journey from victim to leader has inspired changes that extend far beyond your adopted Western territories. You have shown us all that the most beautiful lives are not those untouched by difficulty, but those that transform difficulty into purpose. The recognition from her former home brought Sarah Beth a deep sense of completion. The girl who had fled Boston in shame and despair had become a woman whose influence extended back to the very society that had rejected her. The transformation was not just personal, but generational, creating ripples that would continue to expand long after her own story had ended. As she stood on the balcony of her Denver home, looking west toward the mountains that had sheltered and strengthened her, Sarah Beth reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this point. The mail-order bride deception that had seemed like a cruel trick of fate had actually been the catalyst for a life of purpose and achievement beyond anything she could have imagined. The mountain man, who had said, "You're beautiful as you are," had given her more than love. He had given her the foundation for a legacy that would inspire countless others to see their own scars, not as disfigurements, but as marks of survival, strength, and the infinite possibility for renewal. In the distance, the peak stood eternal and unchanging, their snow-covered summits gleaming in the afternoon sun. They had witnessed her transformation from broken refugee to confident leader, and had sheltered her growth from victim to victor. Now they stood as silent testimony to the truth she had discovered in their embrace, that the most profound beauty comes not from perfection, but from the courage to be fully, authentically human despite all the ways the world might try to diminish us. The mail-order bride with burn scars had become a woman whose true beauty lay in her refusal to be limited by other people's definitions of worth. And in that transformation, she had lit a beacon that would guide others for generations to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.